Chapter 441. Late at night. The flaming velvet city was pitch black. The surging thunder and torrential rain swept over, shrouding everything between heaven and earth in the storm. From time to time, the lightning flashed across the sky, leaving a shocking flash of lightning on the dark curtain of the night, followed by deafening thunder. The flaming velvet castle seemed to be located in the middle of the thunderstorm. The continuous flashes of lightning and bursts of thunder seemed to be able to turn this exquisite and magnificent castle into ashes at any time. The candlelight in the castle seemed to be swaying due to the influx of wind, as if it would be blown out in the next moment. Father-in-law, the lords around Linshui City have responded to my call and sent troops to block the retreat of the Blood Cavalry. Now, it's raining heavily and the road is muddy. It's the best time to trap the Blood Cavalry in Linshui City. Earl Bruggen stood on the balcony of the castle. The flashes of lightning from time to time reflected on his face, making it bright and dark. After a moment, he finally made up his mind and ordered, "Good! Flaming Velvet Army, assemble!" With this order, the 5 knights of the Bruggen family immediately bowed and left the room to gather the army. The Earl of Avon couldn't hide his excitement. The nightmare that had been haunting his mind all this time was finally coming to an end. The humiliation of Alfalfa City was finally going to be completely washed away by this storm. Turning around, the Earl of Avon saw a beautiful figure standing at the door. He felt warm in his heart and quickly walked up to her. He stared at his fiancée's beautiful face and said in a deep voice, "Grace, I will dedicate the glory of this victory to you." Grace smiled gently and lowered her head, as if she couldn't bear the burning gaze of her fiancé. Her bashful appearance made Count Elvin want to pull her into his arms, but when he reached out his hand, Grace took a step back and whispered, "Don't worry, I'm not going to do anything to help you. Then I will pray to my lord for you. May you return victorious as soon as possible." The Earl of Avon's hands stopped awkwardly in midair. He seemed to have realized his impoliteness, so he quickly retracted his hands, bowed, and left quickly. Count Bruggen, who had seen everything, also walked to his daughter and said softly, "When we return victorious this time, you won't resist Evan like this anymore." However, Grace stubbornly pursed her lips and said, disregarding the safety of White Dew City and his family, he only wanted to wash away his shame. He even used the name of the Duke to issue a conscription order to the surrounding feudal lords and used marriage to force the Fire Velvet Army to serve him. This kind of victory is not worth boasting about, and there is not much honor to speak of. But a victory is still a victory, Count Bruggen said seriously. If he wins this battle, he will be the future master of the eastern region. After saying this, Count Bruggen ignored his daughter who was throwing a tantrum and strode out. The rain had stopped. It was as if the heavens also knew that the final battle was approaching. The atmosphere was more or less set, and it was time for the main course to be served. Standing on the city wall of Linshui City, Colin looked at the distant plains in silence. Winter was approaching, and the outskirts were bleak. The heavy rain had gradually become mixed with some snowflakes. At this time, the rain had passed, and the sky was clear, but the temperature had dropped significantly. The north wind whistled past, making people shiver. Amidst the hurried footsteps, a messenger quickly approached. Seeing that Colin had no intention of reaching out to take it, Prince Harrison, who was standing guard at the side, took the military report. After flipping through it, he reported softly, "Teacher, the Fire Velvet Army has moved out." Only then did Colin come back to his senses, and an unfathomable smile appeared on his face. "We are surrounded." Then, he turned to look at the solemn Prince Harrison and asked, "Which direction do you think we should go to break out of the encirclement?" Hearing this, Prince Harrison immediately breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. Even though Colin had always appeared to have a card up his sleeve, Prince Harrison had been unable to remain calm these days as he watched the Eastern Army gather around Linshui City. Hearing Colin's question, Prince Harrison thought that this was a test from his teacher, and hurriedly said the answer he had pondered over for many days. "Teacher, I think we should break out of the encirclement to the west." "Why?" "First, the western side is formed by the allied forces of the various eastern lords. Although they moved out early with the intention of blocking our retreat, their composition is, after all, complex. Without tacit cooperation, it is very difficult to form a unified and coordinated battle rhythm. Even if they have a large number of people, it is the direction we have the most hope of breaking through. Secondly, although the army in the north has fewer people, they are still cavalry. Once entangled, it will be very difficult for us to shake them off. And although there is no enemy in the east, going east will only lead us further and further away until we reach the desperate situation of Radiant Moon Forest. As for the south, there is the strongest army in the east, the Fire Velvet Army, the strongest army in the east. Hearing this, Colin couldn't help but reveal a mocking smile. Prince Harrison also awkwardly touched his nose and said, although the Eastern Army has always been weak, the Fire Velvet Army is, after all, famous. They should still have some strength. We don't have enough troops, so it is best not to gnaw on this hard bone. No. Colin slowly shook his head and said, I want to smash this hard bone. Prince Harrison looked at his teacher in shock. After a long while, he said, Teacher, is this what you meant by taking them by surprise? Colin said seriously, the Eastern Army will definitely not think that I will break through to the south. They think that I will escape to the west, but I have never thought of escaping. The strongest army in the east? I want to crush the pride of the Eastern Army, cross the Alxis Mountains, and kill my way to White Dew City. Prince Harrison's mouth was wide open, and he didn't know what to say. If an ordinary general said such words, he would only think that the general was crazy. However, in the face of this guardian of the Northern Territory who had outstanding military exploits, Prince Harrison suddenly felt that this wasn't a ridiculous joke. Thinking of this, he suddenly felt a rush of blood in his heart. Creating a miracle in a desperate situation, wasn't this a hero? Under Prince Harrison's admiring eyes, Colin ordered the messenger, assemble the army. Woo! The bugle pierced the sky of Linshui City. The residents in the city nervously looked at the blood cavalry soldiers flying by on the street, and they were so scared that they shrank on the roadside and shivered. Colin stood on the city wall, quietly looking at the blood cavalry soldiers gathering at his feet like water, and couldn't help but feel excited. Insufficient troops? The corner of Colin's mouth couldn't help but curl into a sneer. He was going to use these 3,000 blood cavalry soldiers to completely break the backbone of the Eastern Army. Out of the city. Chapter 442. After the autumn rain, the world was bleak. In the wilderness about 100 kilometers south of Linshui City, a large army was moving in a zigzag manner. The banners were bright, the swords were in a forest, the front and back were orderly, and the formation was neat. All aspects showed that this was undoubtedly a strong army. Moreover, whether it was the officers, the ordinary soldiers, or even the knights covered in armor, without exception, they all wore a bouquet of white velvet flowers in front of their chests. Obviously, this was the Fire Velvet Army, known as the strongest army in the eastern region. In the middle of the army, the Earl of Avon was wearing a silver armor and a black cloak, looking quite heroic and extraordinary. But under the surface, the Earl of Avon was already exhausted. After all, the body of a mage was too weak. Such a long march, even though he was riding on horseback, he felt that his waist was about to break and his butt was about to split open. Coupled with the weight of the armor, the Earl of Avon secretly regretted it. If he had known, he would have chosen a lighter armor. Count Brugen also saw the embarrassment of his future son-in-law, but he did not suggest that he take off his armor. This was a great opportunity for the Earl of Avon to win people's hearts and establish his prestige. Of course, Count Brugen would not spoil it. But as time went by, seeing the Earl of Avon on horseback sweating and tottering, Count Brugen knew that he was about to reach his limit. In order to prevent him from making a fool of himself, he had to order the army to stop advancing in advance and set up camp on the spot. The herald looked at the sun hanging high in the sky. Although he was full of doubts, he still faithfully passed down the order. With the help of his squire, the Earl of Avon got off his warhorse with difficulty. He staggered and almost lost his balance. "Thank you, father-in-law." The Earl of Avon held Count Brugen's outstretched hand and thanked him softly. Of course, he knew that the other party ordered to set up camp so early in order to take care of him. He was both grateful and embarrassed. Count Bruggen put his hand on the Earl of Avon's arm and said with a smile, "After all, you are not a knight. It's not surprising that you can't withstand such a high-intensity march. You don't have to blame yourself. Moreover, the encirclement against the bloody cavalry has been formed. They can't escape even if they have wings. So, we are not in a hurry." The Earl of Avon gasped for breath for a while, and seemed to have finally caught his breath. Hearing this, he smiled and said, "Father-in-law, I still want to hurry to Linshui City and personally see the sorry state of the northern frontier guardian." Count Bruggen laughed and said, "No rush, no rush. I guess the blood cavalry should have received the news of the Fire Velvet Army's attack. I wonder which direction the northern frontier guardian will choose to break out of the encirclement. If there is no accident, the bloody cavalry should go west." The Earl of Avon said with certainty, "I think so too." Count Bruggen nodded. "I hope the Lord's coalition army in the west can block the blood cavalry's attack." "Don't worry, father-in-law." The Earl of Avon smiled confidently. "If the main force of the blood cavalry is in Linshui City, then I'm really worried that they can break out of the encirclement. But now there are only 3,000 blood cavalry in Linshui City, and the Lord's coalition army in the west has gathered more than 150,000 men. With such a disparity in strength, it's impossible for Colin Angeli to escape." Count Bruggen nodded and felt that he was worrying too much. He smiled and said, "Maybe after exploring the surrounding situation, the people of the northern frontier won't have the courage to leave Linshui City." That's the best. When the Fire Velvet Army arrives at Linshui City, I'll personally write a letter to Colin Angeli to persuade him to surrender. Then you can also think about what price the northern frontier should pay to redeem this person." The father-in-law and son-in-law chatted and laughed, as if they had already determined that the blood cavalry in Linshui City couldn't make any waves. After chatting and laughing for a while, Count Bruggen said, "You take a rest first, I'll go patrol the camp." The Earl of Avon sat down against a thick tree trunk. The squire wanted to help him take off his armor, but the Earl of Avon shook his head and refused. "No hurry, let's wait until it's dark." Turning his head, he saw his guardian knight, Fletcher, standing not far away. His whole body was covered in armor and his back was straight, as if such a long journey didn't affect him at all. The Earl of Avon was a little envious, but he still said loudly, "Knight Fletcher, sit over here and take a rest." Hearing this, the Knight Fletcher walked over and bowed. He didn't even take off his helmet and just sat down silently. The Earl of Avon asked with concern, "How's your injury?" The Knight Fletcher was stunned and hesitated for a moment. Then he replied in a stiff and hoarse voice, "It's nothing serious." Then he fell into silence again. The Earl of Avon couldn't see the expression on the Knight Fletcher's face under the armor, but he felt that he could understand how he felt. He thought that the Knight Fletcher was still blaming himself and feeling ashamed about what happened in Alfalfa City, so he reached out and patted the Knight Fletcher's armor to comfort him. "Don't worry, we'll be able to wash away that shame soon." The Knight Fletcher nodded and still didn't speak. The Earl of Avon looked at the busy but orderly Fire Velvet Army camp and fell silent for a moment. As the second son of the Duke, he actually didn't have much experience in leading an army. The House of St. Prospero's direct army, the Pegasus Legion, had always been commanded by his brother, Marquis Vincent. Although he had always acted like he didn't care about it, the Earl of Avon still hoped to have a powerful army that could charge for him. Especially when he found that the position of Duke of the Eastern region was within his reach, this idea became extremely strong. Although the Fire Velvet Army in front of him was powerful, it was still the private army of the Bruggen family. Perhaps, after this battle, he would have to pay more attention to the rebuilding of the Pegasus Legion. The sun gradually set in the west, and the Fire Velvet Army camp began to smell the aroma of meat. The Earl of Avon had already taken the roasted lamb leg that his squire handed over to him and started to chew on it. After eating for a while, he asked with some doubt, "Is Earl Bruggen not back yet?" The squire shook his head and said, "My lord, do you want me to go and take a look?" "No need." The Earl of Avon waved his hand and buried his head in the lamb leg in front of him again. At this moment, the sound of hurried horse hooves made the Earl of Avon raise his head again. "Father-in-law, dinner is ready, come quickly." The Earl of Avon was halfway through his sentence when he saw that Earl Brugen's expression wasn't right, so he swallowed the rest of his sentence. Earl Brugen flipped off his horse and said anxiously, "We've met the Blood Cavalry's sentries." The Earl of Avon was stunned for a moment before he said, "The Blood Cavalry can't be coming in our direction, right? Could it be the scouts they left in the south to keep an eye on the Fire Velvet Army?" "Impossible." Earl Brugen shook his head firmly. "It's not one or two scattered sentries, it's a formation of sentries. The sentries we sent out to scout all suffered a great loss. The Blood Cavalry must be nearby." The Earl of Avon opened his mouth wide, obviously shocked by this news. Earl Brugen had already decisively ordered, "Get into formation. Prepare to meet the enemy." Chapter 443. When the Fire Velvet Army realized that the Blood Cavalry was nearby, the Blood Cavalry also discovered the location of the Fire Velvet Army. Before the two armies clashed, their respective Sentinel Cavalry had already launched a brutal battle. But obviously, the Sentinel Cavalry of the Blood Cavalry had the obvious upper hand and killed the Sentinel Cavalry of the Fire Velvet Army. Later on, Earl Brugen did not dare to send out the Sentinel Cavalry to scout the surrounding situation anymore. In terms of individual bravery and cooperation in small-scale battles, the Fire Velvet Army could not compare to the Blood Cavalry, who had been fighting with trolls on the Sky Ice Field for many years. If the Sentinel Cavalry could not be sent out, the Fire Velvet Army was no different from a blind man. They only knew that the enemy was nearby, but they did not know in which direction, when and where the enemy would suddenly launch an attack on them. The fear of the unknown was the most torturous. The Earl of Avon, who had not experienced much battle, was already a little flustered. Fortunately, Earl Brugen did not panic. No matter how powerful the Blood Cavalry was, their main force was not here. The Fire Velvet Army still had an absolute advantage in terms of military strength. This advantage allowed Earl Brugen to remain calm, and he calmly issued orders, commanding the Fire Velvet Army to get into a defensive formation. At the same time, he did not forget to smile and comfort his son-in-law beside him. "Don't be nervous, I don't know what Colin Angeli is thinking. He actually chose to escape to the south, but if he really dares to attack the Fire Velvet Army's formation with only 3,000 cavalrymen in his hands, I will definitely make sure he doesn't return." The Earl of Avon looked at the Fire Velvet Army's orderly and distinct military formation, and his heart began to calm down. He smiled and replied, "Father-in-law, do you think Colin Angeli is bluffing?" "Bluffing?" "That's right." After the Earl of Avon calmed down, his mind returned to normal. When he saw that the Fire Velvet Army's formation was watertight, would he deliberately leave a part of the Sentinel Cavalry to cover our eyes and ears? In fact, he has already led his army past us and continued south to attack the Fire Velvet City? Attack the Fire Velvet City? That's right. The Earl of Avon's expression changed, and he said seriously, "The Fire Velvet Army has all been brought out by us. Isn't the Fire Velvet City now extremely empty? No wonder the Bloody Cavalry chose to break through to the south. They want to lure the Fire Velvet Army out, then bypass the Fire Velvet Army and directly attack Fire Velvet City." "That's possible." Count Brugen nodded, but then laughed disdainfully. How could Tinder City be so easily breached? Although the Fire Velvet Army had been brought out by me, there were still tens of thousands of guards in the city. Relying on the sturdy and tall city walls, it wouldn't be a problem to block the attack of 3,000 Blood Cavalry. When Colin suffers a setback at the foot of Tinder City, we will lead the army back and surround them from the front and back. We will definitely bury this Bloody Cavalry completely at the foot of Mount Alsace. The Earl of Avon heaved a sigh of relief. Just as he was about to praise his father-in-law, he heard the sound of galloping horses approaching. Tap, tap, tap. Count Brugen's expression changed and he immediately shouted, "Get into formation. Meet the enemy." In fact, there was no need for him to give the order. When the soldiers of the Fire Velvet Army saw the oncoming cavalry, they were already nervous. A circle of huge shields was erected on the periphery, turning the entire army formation of the Fire Velvet Army into a tortoise shell in an instant. The long spears that pierced through the gaps of the huge shields made this tortoise shell look particularly ferocious. This was the best way for infantry to deal with cavalry in the wild. A phalanx of shields and spears. As the bloody cavalry approached, the Earl of Avon unconsciously held his breath. He just thought that he had guessed Colin's idea, but reality gave him a hard slap in the face. The bloody cavalry did not bypass the Fire Velvet Army to attack Tinder City, and it seemed that they intended to storm the Fire Velvet Army's army formation. But soon, the Earl of Avon found that he had guessed wrong again. At least, this cavalry troop of close to 1,000 people was not here to charge into the battle formation. The previous charge seemed fierce, stirring up a lot of dust and creating a lot of momentum, but they suddenly pulled the reins in the safe zone outside the battle formation of the Fire Velvet Army. Then, as they turned their horses' heads, they drew their bows and began to shoot. The dense arrows fell like a rainstorm, and the phalanx of the Fire Velvet Army was in a commotion. But in fact, because of the protection of shields and the complete armor of the Fire Velvet Army, the arrow rain did not cause much damage. But this bloody cavalry team of about 1,000 people rushed back and still kept a safe distance to launch projectile shots. The archers of the Fire Velvet Army also began to fight back, but the target moving at high speed was obviously more difficult to hit, so the casualties of both sides were very sporadic. But this kind of counterattack still had to be carried out. Otherwise, if they were beaten without fighting back, the morale of the army would soon decline, and the psychological pressure of the soldiers would also rise. The Earl of Avon looked at the bloody cavalry going back and forth, and saw that they were not as horrible as he had imagined. He was relieved and could not help but laugh. It seems that the bloody cavalry is just SOSO. Earl Brugen glanced at him and knew that he had not been on the battlefield much, so he patiently explained, "They are testing." Testing? Yes. Just like an experienced hunter, they are looking for the weakness of their prey, and when they find it, they will launch a thunderous attack. The Earl of Avon looked serious, but he still pretended to be relaxed and laughed. But in the face of the Fire Velvet Army's phalanx of giant shields and spears, even the bloody cavalry can't do anything, right? Earl Brugen did not answer. The layman watched the show, while the expert watched the skill. Just these few rounds of probing attacks launched by the bloody cavalry, Earl Brugen already knew that the other party could indeed be called the strongest cavalry he had ever seen in his life. No wonder they could defeat the trolls in the Firmament Ice Field. In fact, since the Sky Horse troop was completely wiped out in Silvermoon City, the nobles of the eastern region had been paying 120% attention to this terrifying cavalry of the northern frontier. And the Fire Velvet Army, as the strongest army in the eastern region, immediately made how to deal with the cavalry, or rather, how to deal with the bloody cavalry, the first priority of their daily training. But no matter how targeted the training, no matter how well prepared Earl Brugen was, when he really faced the bloody cavalry on the battlefield, he finally felt this kind of substantial pressure. Even if the other party had not started the most explosive charge, Earl Brugen was already beginning to worry whether the phalanx of the Fire Velvet Army could withstand the impact of the bloody cavalry. Feeling the oppressive atmosphere, the Earl of Avon also tactfully shut his mouth. Not long after, the bloody cavalry that was hovering around the Fire Velvet Army suddenly went far away, and the battlefield returned to peace for a moment. This made many of the Fire Velvet Army soldiers feel particularly uncomfortable. "Is it over?" the Earl of Avon asked doubtfully. Earl Brugen's expression was extremely stagnant. He slowly shook his head and said in a deep voice, "The real battle has just begun." Chapter 444. The battlefield fell into a strange silence. But such a silence made the soldiers of the Fire Velvet Army nervous, so that they could only hear their own breathing. Finally, the blood cavalry moved. The rumbling sound of the horses' hooves was like thunder in spring, which instantly made the wilderness boil. Two cavalry teams of about 700 to 800 people began to speed up and rush to the right rear wing of the Fire Velvet Army. This was the most chaotic position in the tentative attack just now. Shields up. Spears, press forward. In the Fire Velvet Army, the orders of the officers rose one after another. The shield soldiers and spear soldiers in the front row built a steel thorn with their flesh and blood, trying to block the charge of the iron cavalry in front of them. However, many of them were already trembling in fear. Being members of the Fire Velvet Army, these soldiers were definitely elites in the eastern region. At least the fire velvet flowers on their chests were picked by themselves on the cliffs of 3,000 meters high. Moreover, in order to prepare for the battle with the Blood Cavalry, the Fire Velvet Army specially practiced with the cavalry of the eastern region. However, when they really faced the rolling iron hooves of the Blood Cavalry, they were shocked to find that compared with the Blood Cavalry, the cavalry of the eastern region was as docile as a flock of sheep. In the trembling of the earth, the two cavalry teams of the Blood Cavalry had rushed to a certain distance, and all the cavalrymen began to draw their bows. Bush, bush, bush. Different from the previous tentative projectile shooting, this time the Blood Cavalry was close enough to aim and shoot directly. For a time, the casualties of the Fire Velvet Army increased rapidly, especially the spear soldiers in the periphery. The shields in front of them were used to block the cavalry's attack, but could not provide them with complete protection. And in order to keep the battle formation neat, they could not avoid the arrows even if they saw them coming. They could only be shot down one by one like statues. But after all, the Fire Velvet Army was the elite of the eastern region, so they did not riot in such a situation. Moreover, under the orders of the officers, the archers in the rear of the position also began to fight back. As a result, casualties began to appear in the Blood Cavalry. The cavalrymen were shot down from their horses, and the horses fell to the ground because of the arrows. But the two cavalry teams did not slow down, nor did they distance themselves. They continued to approach the Fire Velvet Army, and at the same time, they continued to draw their bows and shoot. This was a competition of courage. Closer. It was getting closer. The shield bearers at the outermost perimeter of the Fire Velvet Army had already tightened their muscles and were ready to receive the next impact. But what they didn't expect was that the two teams of bloody cavalry turned around at the last moment. The two cavalry formations seemed to have collided with a transparent barrier as they shot out along the tangential line. Such a quick turn was a test of the horsemanship of the cavalry, as well as the coordination and discipline of the cavalry. The slightest mistake would cause the cavalry to crash into each other, which would lead to a series of tragic collisions. The officers in the Fire Velvet Army who knew a little about cavalry tactics were all stunned. Obviously, they did not expect to see such a dazzling equestrian coordination on the battlefield. But before they could recover from the shock, they saw another cavalry formation rushing out from the center of the Blood Cavalry Army that was separated to both sides. Shield up, shield up. Hoarse roars echoed out from the Fire Velvet Army. Because this time, it was a group of heavy cavalry. Only then did they understand that the two teams of bloody cavalry were just feints, and this was the fatal blow. The earth began to tremble in the rumbling sound of horse hooves. At this moment, it seemed that nothing could stop the heavy cavalry of the bloody cavalry. Forward. Forward again. Accelerate. Accelerate again. No hesitation, no avoidance, even if there was a steel forest of spears in front of them. This heavy cavalry team accelerated to the extreme terrifying speed and crashed into the enemy. Boom. In an instant, it seemed that the world had quieted down, and time had been paused. The next moment, the cruelty continued. One by one, the war horses were pierced by the spears, and the cavalrymen were knocked down one by one. But their men and war horses still crashed into the Fire Velvet Army's formation with terrifying inertia. A ferocious gap immediately appeared in the originally intact position. Hiss! Count Bruggen sucked in a cold breath. Looking at these well-equipped, well-trained, and fearless heavy cavalry smashing into his army formation, he felt sorry for them. He couldn't help but curse, "Wastrels!" At the same time, Count Bruggen heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. Although the bloody cavalry's heavy cavalry was quite terrifying, they were too few in number and didn't have enough follow-up support. Although a huge gap had been torn in the Fire Velvet Army's right flank, Count Bruggen knew that the other side could no longer expand their victory. Next, as long as he calmly responded and commanded the soldiers to stabilize their position, they could plug this gap and stop the collapse from spreading. But in the next moment, Count Bruggen's eyes widened. because the heavy cavalry that he thought had no more strength continued to tear apart the Fire Velvet Army's right flank formation with an incomprehensible force. They were a bunch of lunatics. Count Bruggen saw with his own eyes that a heavy cavalry with 3 spears stuck in his body continued to charge forward as if nothing had happened. And the one whose armor was completely deformed by the collision of the shield, the one who fell heavily from the warhorse, and the one whose arm was broken, they were all still fighting. No one retreated, they were all moving forward. Count Bruggen couldn't understand. Didn't these people feel pain? Weren't they afraid of death? And what made Count Bruggen even more inexplicably shocked was that this group of about 500 heavy cavalry were all professionals. Where did the bloody cavalry get so many professionals who weren't afraid of death? Especially the 3 who were charging at the front, they seemed to be level 5 professionals. Did Colin Angeli pull all the high-level professionals in the northern frontier into the bloody cavalry? Where did he get such great prestige to make so many masters die for him? Father-in-law, the right flank can't hold on any longer. The Earl of Avon's anxious reminder brought Count Bruggen back to his senses. He hurriedly suppressed the shock and fear in his heart and called for the messenger. But before he could give the order, he suddenly felt the world around him spinning. The next second, the whole world seemed to have turned dark. The sky wasn't dark, but in the eyes of the Earl of Avon, the whole world seemed to have lost its color. Because he watched with his own eyes as his father-in-law, the supreme commander of the Fire Velvet Army, was beheaded just like that, surrounded by his own army. Dong dong. It wasn't until the bloody head rolled a few meters on the ground that the Earl of Avon realized that the person who did it was his guardian knight, Fletcher. Chapter 445. The battle was still going on. But the center of the Fire Velvet Army fell into a strange silence. It was as if time and space here had been paused and was completely cut off from the surroundings. The Earl of Avon looked at his guardian knight in a daze, as if he had just met him for the first time. The personal guards around Count Bruggen also seemed to have frozen in place. They even forgot to catch the murderer of their lord whom they were loyal to. It was not until Knight Fletcher rushed to the flag of the Fire Velvet Army with a long sword dripping with blood and cut it in half that the surrounding personal guards finally woke up from their daze and rushed to Fletcher, the traitor. In a desperate situation, Knight Fletcher seemed to have accepted his fate and allowed 7 or 8 long swords to pierce through his body and then slowly fell to the ground. The Earl of Avon rushed to Knight Fletcher's body like a madman and desperately took off his helmet. Of course, the Earl of Avon was not heartbroken over the death of his knight, but he wanted to confirm his identity. However, when that familiar face appeared in front of him, the last trace of hope in the Earl of Avon's heart was completely shattered. The Earl of Avon wanted to grab Knight Fletcher and ask him. His most loyal knight had actually killed his father-in-law on the battlefield. The world seemed to have played an extremely malicious joke on him, but at this moment, the Earl of Avon could not laugh at all. Kill him and avenge the Earl. A knight of the Bruggen family roared. But then someone stopped him. Are you crazy? After all, he is the son of the Duke of St. Prospero. But he killed the Earl. That was his knight who killed him. Without his order, how dare his knight do that? That doesn't mean we can kill him. The blood of the Paladin family is not so easy to taint. What do you think we should do? Take him back to Fire Velvet City for trial. Who will judge him? Just as the knights of the Bruggen family were arguing, the Earl of Avon finally calmed down. He did not care about the soldiers of the Fire Velvet Army that surrounded him and the gazes that were glaring at him covetously. You want to judge me? You have to survive from the bloody cavalry first. These words woke everyone up. When they looked back, they saw that the light cavalry that had originally scattered to the 2 sides had circled back and almost seamlessly connected with each other to apply pressure on the gap in the formation that had been torn apart by the heavy cavalry. All of this was coordinated quite well. As the front row of the shield and spear formation had been completely dispersed, the right wing of the Fire Velvet Army had been flattened. Chaos began to appear. Actually, it was not that the Fire Velvet Army did not have the power to fight. Although the bloody cavalry tore open the gap on the right wing, they were too inferior in number after all, and could not expand the battle results quickly enough to completely secure the victory. Therefore, as long as the Fire Velvet Army could respond quickly and calmly, they could still prevent a complete collapse. However, the prerequisite for all of this was that the Fire Velvet Army must have a calm and experienced commander. It just so happened that such a commander, Count Bruggen, was already dead. None of the remaining officers would yield to the other, and they quarreled endlessly over how to deal with the present crisis. At this time, the importance of the decision-maker was reflected. Many times, even a wrong decision was better than no decision at all. Originally, with the identity of the Earl of Avon, after the death of Count Bruggen, he should have automatically become the commander of the Fire Velvet Army. Unfortunately, Count Bruggen died in the hands of the Earl of Avon's knights. As a result, no one would listen to whatever the Earl of Avon said, let alone resolve the dispute between these officers and finalize a decision. The quarrel continued, and the chaos on the right wing of the Fire Velvet Army continued to expand. Moreover, the news of Count Bruggen's death slowly began to spread among the Fire Velvet Army. Everything was falling into an irreversible abyss. The Earl of Avon looked at the scene in front of him helplessly, and his heart kept sinking. At the same time, a terrible thought emerged in the depths of his mind. Could it be that all of this was planned by Colin Angelo? How could I have planned all of this? At the rear of the Fire Velvet Army, Colin said to Prince Harrison with a smile, "Didn't I tell you that the battlefield changes rapidly and accidents happen all the time? No one can predict everything. However, when the enemy makes a mistake, what you need to do is not to think about why, but to seize this fleeting opportunity." After finishing his sentence, Colin turned to the 1,000+ cavalry that had yet to participate in the battle and ordered, "Let's go. Reserve troops, get into formation." With Colin's order, these blood cavalry soldiers who could not wait to go into battle immediately began to spur their horses forward, gradually accelerating. Seeing that Colin was also moving forward with the troops, Prince Harrison asked anxiously, "Teacher, are you going to charge into the formation too?" "That's right," Colin said without turning his head back. "Then can I go with you?" Hearing this, Colin finally turned his head and saw the young prince with a face full of excitement and Princess Judy beside him, who was also eager to try. He suddenly felt a headache. "No." "Why?" Prince Harrison was not convinced. "There are no knights of the San Lorenzo family who do not dare to charge." "That's right." Princess Judy also shouted, as if she wanted to see the world in chaos. "But the knights of the San Lorenzo family will not charge for an Earl of the Empire," Colin said coldly. Prince Harrison was stunned. That's right, if he joined this battle, wouldn't it mean that the royal family was on the side of the northern frontier, and even the Angeli family? Prince Harrison really didn't know what kind of political storm this would cause. However, he still understood that this might not be the result that his father wanted, and it might not be the result that his teacher wanted either. Especially when the orcs were about to invade. What the Empire of Light needed most now was unity. No matter how the Angeli family and the House of Saint Prospero fought, the San Lorenzo family could not join the battle personally. Otherwise, how could the royal family call on the human lords to unite and fight against the foreign enemies? Therefore he hesitated. After rejecting the two whimsical little fellows, Colin squeezed the horse's belly and quickly arrived at the front row of the formation. Looking at the Tinder Army formation not far away, Colin thought of the moment when he followed Marquis Garcia to charge against the 300,000 troll army on the Sky Ice Field. It was from that moment onwards that Colin fell deeply in love with the battlefield. He fell in love with the feeling of galloping unhindered, leading an invincible cavalry to tear the enemy into pieces. Colin squeezed the horse's belly tightly, bent down slightly, lowered the helmet's mask, and slowly leveled the lance. The 1,000 riders behind him did the same action almost simultaneously. The next moment, the whole army sped up. It was like a sudden explosion of thunder, and also like a huge wave crashing onto the shore. The rumbling sound of horse hooves was like the footsteps of the Grim Reaper, constantly approaching the Tinder Army formation. In the end, these 1,000 riders under the personal leadership of Colin crashed into the Tinder Army formation that was already on the verge of collapse. Boom! Chapter 446. Colin took the lead, and thousands of bloody cavalry followed closely behind. They crashed into the Fire Velvet Army's battle formation in an unstoppable manner. Their invasion was the last straw that broke the camel's back. The right wing of the Fire Velvet Army, which had already been torn open, became even more fragmented under such an impact. The massacre was unfolding at an unimaginable speed. Countless soldiers of the Fire Velvet Army were trampled, crushed, and sent flying. This horrible scene had become the nightmare of all the soldiers of the Fire Velvet Army. They forgot to escape, to shout, and even to resist. They were completely in a muddle-headed state. They were like a flock of lambs waiting to be slaughtered, watching themselves being devoured by ferocious wolves one by one. All the soldiers of the Fire Velvet Army who were watching all of this suddenly felt that something called faith had collapsed in their minds. The strongest army in the eastern region. Now it seemed that in front of a truly strong army, it was simply a joke. A self-boasting and self-amusing joke. What was more ridiculous was that the Fire Velvet Army was not even facing the main force of the bloody cavalry. There were only 3,000 of them. 50,000 against 3,000? It was actually such a situation. After the collapse of faith, people would often become extremely weak because they lost their spiritual support. An emotion called fear took advantage of this and began to sweep through the hearts of the soldiers of the Fire Velvet Army. How could they possibly defeat such a bloody cavalry? They were a group of lunatics who were not afraid of death and did not seem to be able to die. However, this group of lunatics, whether in terms of personal strength or tactical accomplishment, were all terrifying and overwhelming. Even though the Fire Velvet Army had an absolute advantage in terms of military strength, they were still slaughtered without any power to fight back. In addition to the bizarre death of their commander-in-chief, Count Brugen, the group of Fire Velvet Army officers who were still arguing about how to stabilize the situation were completely desperate at this time. Stabilize the situation, my ass. The Fire Velvet Army. It was over. At this time, there was only one thought left in their minds: run. The honor of the knights, the oath of loyalty, the revenge of the king, none of them were as important as their own lives. When this group of officers began to take the lead to run, the Fire Velvet Army was completely destined to walk towards an unstoppable destruction. Humans had a herd mentality. Especially on the battlefield, when one's emotions were in an extremely excited and tense state, it was very difficult for most people to maintain a clear and calm thinking ability, and only the instinct to follow the crowd was left. If everyone else ran away, what should I do? Of course, he had to run as well. Moreover, it was the officers who led the way. Even if there were some brave warriors who wanted to turn the tide, they could only be swept away by the chain reaction. Finally, the collapse of the right wing of the Fire Velvet Army spread rapidly and turned into an unstoppable collapse of the entire army. Actually, from the start of the war until now, the Fire Velvet Army had only suffered a few thousand casualties. Compared to the Fire Velvet Army's total military strength of 50,000, these casualties were actually not much. However, when the army formation was broken and the soldiers scrambled to escape, they had already lost their organization and were no different from a group of lambs waiting to be slaughtered. This was often the case in war. Face-to-face combat would not cause too many casualties. The real casualties were actually caused when one side collapsed and the other side rushed over. This was especially obvious in a battle between cavalry and infantry. At this time, the situation on the battlefield had already entered the most familiar rhythm of the blood cavalry's division hunting. Even without Colin's command, they had automatically formed into teams of 100 people. Like sharp blades, they elegantly and cruelly cut the Fire Velvet Army into small pieces. That scene was simply like a soul-stirring artistic performance. Of course, this was the art of killing. Even if many soldiers of the Fire Velvet Army had put down their weapons and knelt down to surrender, what awaited them was still the merciless knife of the blood cavalry. Before the war, Colin had issued an order not to accept surrender. As a lone army deep in the enemy's hinterland, accepting captives was too extravagant because they did not have the energy to arrange and control the captives. Moreover, Colin had already made up his mind to use this war to completely break the backbone of the eastern region, so that they would be afraid of the army of the north from the bottom of their hearts. As for how many broken families there would be behind these slaughtered soldiers, Colin did not want to think about it. A general's success was built on thousands of dead bodies. On the battlefield, there was no room for mercy. The Earl of Avon stood stupidly in the same place, looking at everything in front of him with dull eyes. It was as if everything around him was blocked by an invisible membrane. Everything seemed to be no longer real, and everything seemed to be meaningless. The Earl of Avon was actually not convinced by the defeat of Alfalfa City. From his point of view, it wasn't that he had lost to Colin Angeli, but that he had misjudged Earl Hall's mentality. If it were not for the betrayal of the Hall family, the people of the northern frontier would not have been able to cross the New Shui River, and he would not have had to flee from Alfalfa City. But now, when he was defeated by Colin Angeli again, and under the circumstances of absolute superiority, the Earl of Avon only felt that the whole world was gloomy. If he could not win, then how could he defeat him? An enemy that was too powerful would only make people lose the courage to fight. The Earl of Avon was in such a state now. Although Count Bruggen's personal guards no longer cared about the Earl of Avon at this time, he still stood stupidly in the same place, with no intention of escaping at all. Until a figure covered in blood rushed in front of him, greeting him with a mocking tone. "Oh, I didn't expect to meet you again so soon, Earl of Avon." The Earl of Avon's slackened pupils refocused, and only then did he recognize the knight in front of him. It was Colin Angeli. Even if he lost, he would not lose. Moreover, as the second son of the Duke of the Eastern region, the Earl of Avon still had his own pride. So he immediately straightened his back, and even had a calm smile on his face as he said, "Yes, Earl of Avon. I really didn't expect that you would dare to rush to the hinterland of the Eastern region with such a small number of people. Aren't you afraid that you won't be able to return to the northern frontier?" Colin laughed, pointed to the flaming velvet army that was being crazily slaughtered by the blood cavalry, and said disdainfully, "Do you people of the Eastern region have the ability to make me stay? Look at this so-called strongest army of the Eastern region. Hee, it's not even as good as the bandits of the northern frontier. If the Eastern region army only has this little ability, believe it or not, I can turn the entire Eastern region upside down with just 20,000 blood cavalry." The Earl of Avon was so angry that the corners of his mouth twitched. There was no other way. Although Colin was arrogant, he had the capital to be arrogant. Taking a deep breath, the Earl of Avon stopped asking for a snub and asked, "So, Earl Angeli, are you still going to let me go unconditionally this time?" Colin touched his chin, shook his head and said, "I won't let you go this time, you're not honest. I think it's better to take you to the White Dew City. It should be of some use." The Earl of Avon immediately sneered and said, "Earl Angeli, if you think that father will open the gate of the White Dew City for a disappointing son like me, then you're too naive." Colin smiled faintly and said, "No. I just want to kill you outside the White Dew City and humiliate the Duke of St. Prospero." The Earl of Avon. Chapter 447. Tinder City. The city gate was tightly shut. Although Count Bruggen had already predicted that the bloody cavalry of Waterside City would definitely choose to break through the encirclement to the west, he still ordered the city gate to be closed out of caution. He also ordered the city guards to be on high alert. However, such a move worried the traveling caravans. The Alxis Mountains divided the eastern region into two. However, the road behind Tinder City was not the only one that could travel between the north and the south. The problem was that the other roads were all rugged mountain roads. Only the valley in Tinder City could allow large caravans to pass through smoothly. Now that Tinder City was forbidden to enter or leave, these merchants were at a loss. "Mr. Sunders, you only need to open the gate for 10 minutes and let our caravan pass through Tinder City, and this bag of gold coins will be yours." Knight Sunders glanced at the heavy bag in the merchant's hand but did not reach out to take it. Instead, he spoke with an expressionless face. "Mr. Mori, for the sake of our many years of friendship, I will not report your bribery to Count Bruggen. However, don't expect me to ignore Count Bruggen's order and open the gate for you." Mori became anxious and tried to persuade again, "Mr. Sunders, we only need 10 minutes, and you can decide when to open the gate." As long as you think it's safe, even if it's in the middle of the night. Knight Sunders sneered and said, Mr. Mori, do you know how Waterside City fell? Mori heard this and said in a wrong tone, I did hear some news. But Mr. Sunders, I'm a true Eastern Region citizen. Not those damned half-elves. Besides, you and I have known each other for so many years. Do you still think I'm a spy from the northern frontier? Knight Sunders still shook his head firmly and said, I'm sorry. I won't open the gate even if there's a little risk. Mori was so anxious that his forehead was covered in sweat. He still did not want to give up. Mr. Sunders, your worries are completely unnecessary. As long as the northern frontier people are not stupid, they will not choose to come south. Tinder City is indestructible, and it blocked the only way across the mountain. They will only die if they come here. Knight Sunders suddenly raised a hand and stopped Mori's long-winded persuasion. Just as Emoli was puzzled, he saw a small black dot appear outside the city and was approaching Fire Velvet City. The black dot was very fast, and it didn't take long for them to see that it was a cavalry squad of about 10 people. However, when Emoli saw the tall mountain flaming velvet flag and the familiar military uniform, he heaved a sigh of relief and said, Sir, perhaps there is good news from the front line. Knight Sunders relaxed a little, but he still did not give the order to open the gate. When the cavalrymen arrived at the wall, their leader took off his helmet, revealing a familiar face. Knight Sunders ordered his soldiers, Get ready. Open the city gates. The soldier accepted the order and left. Mr. Sunders, now that you've opened the gate, can you let our caravan through? Mori quickly approached Sunders with a flattering smile. Knight Sunders hesitated. Let me ask about the situation at the front line first. Good. Very well. Mori nodded and stuffed the bag of gold coins into the knight's hand. Sunders frowned but did not return the bag. When Mori saw this, he immediately smiled happily. The gate of Fire Velvet City was a drawbridge. As the soldiers worked hard to turn the winch, steel cables as thick as a baby's arm slowly extended out, and the drawbridge finally landed heavily on the moat. The cavalry squad outside the city then crossed the drawbridge and entered the city. Knight Trit, how is the situation at the front line? Knight Sunders walked down from the city wall and asked with a smile. Very good, Knight Cut replied calmly, and then climbed up the tower. Knight Sunders was stunned. Although he felt that the other party's tone and attitude were a little strange, he did not stop him. He only followed up and asked in a low voice, What do you mean by very well? Did you successfully besiege the bloody cavalry in Waterside City? Knight Trit did not answer. Instead, he kept walking forward. Knight Sunders scratched his head and thought it was a military secret, so he asked, Then what mission did you come back for this time? Knight Trit nodded, indicating that he did have a mission, but as for what the mission was, he did not say a word. Knight Sunders was a little annoyed. He thought that he had a good relationship with Knight Trit, but the other party was so cold to him at this moment. He could not help but go up and stop the other party, saying, What's wrong with you? Why did you go up the city tower without saying a word? At this moment, Knight Sunders finally met Knight Trit's gaze. But what kind of gaze was that? Indifferent, cold, like a piece of ice that never melted on the peak of Alsace. Only then did Knight Sunders realize that something was wrong, but Knight Trit suddenly rushed forward and knocked him aside. Knight Sunders took a few steps back awkwardly and steadied himself. When he looked back and saw the target that Knight Trit rushed to, he was shocked and shouted anxiously, Quick! Stop him quickly! He wants to destroy the winch. However, the soldiers on the city tower obviously did not react. They were still staring blankly at Knight Trit, who was emitting a strong holy light and wielding a warhammer, rushing over. Bang! In the next second, the warhammer in Knight Trit's hand smashed heavily on the winch that controlled the suspension bridge. In an instant, countless wood shavings and iron fragments flew everywhere. What are you trying to do? Knight Sunders immediately pulled out his long sword and roared in shock and anger. Knight Trit, however, seemed to have completed his mission. He stood there with his hands tied and did not move, allowing Knight Sunders to place the long sword on his throat. Trit, if you don't give me a reasonable explanation, when the count comes back. At this moment, Night Sunders suddenly saw a long black thin line on the horizon outside the city. Thump, thump, thump. The earth began to tremble, and so did Night Sunders' body. He finally understood and roared angrily at Night Trit in front of him, "You traitor!" Under the city tower, Merchant Morley was still instructing his servant to quickly send a letter out, asking the caravan to come to Tinder City immediately. But then he also felt the earth trembling. Bloody cavalry! The bloody cavalry is here! Hearing the shouts and seeing the black torrent coming from outside the city, Morley was scared out of his wits. He immediately shouted back, "Close the gate! Hurry up and close the gate!" However, the gate did not move at all. When Morley was about to run up the city tower to see what was going on, he saw a group of panicked soldiers running down from the city tower. Morley grabbed one of them and questioned in a hoarse voice, "Why aren't you closing the gate?" That person trembled and answered, "Can't. Night Trit betrayed us, destroyed the winch." Morley heard this and his legs gave out. He fell to the ground just like that. The servant had long run away. Morley struggled to get up several times, but his legs were too weak and he could not get up at all. The rumbling sound of horse hooves was getting closer and closer. Morley knew he could not run away, so he quickly rolled to the side of the road and covered his head with his hands like an ostrich. Soon, the thunderous sound of horse hooves arrived. The dust raised by the hooves almost buried Morley. Then came the sounds of killing and screams. Morley did not dare to look up anymore. He could only pray to the god of light, hoping that the bloody cavalry would not see a small figure like him. Chapter 448. Why was the blood cavalry here? Where was the fire velvet army? Morley was lying on the ground, his head full of doubts. He felt that the sound of hooves behind him would never end. Countless cavalrymen were breaking into the fire velvet city one after another. Morley didn't know how long he had been lying on the ground. His head was dizzy and his ears were buzzing. He felt dizzy, but he didn't dare to get up. He didn't even have the courage to look up. Nobody came to check on him, so Morley thought that his strategy of pretending to be a dead body should be successful. As long as he kept pretending, he wouldn't have to face those ferocious blood cavalry. Unfortunately, Morley's dream was soon shattered. Because a war horse stopped beside him. The hot breath from the horse's nose was blowing on Morley's head. He wanted to continue pretending to be dead, but he didn't dare to. "You get up," a young and majestic voice ordered. Morley had no choice but to raise his head. He saw a young general in blood-red armor riding a tall horse, looking at him coldly. Behind the young general were two children, a boy and a girl. They were wearing exquisite armor. It was obvious that they were not ordinary people. However, why did the flame emblem on the armor look so familiar? Morley thought as he climbed to his feet, trembling. Royal family. Morley, who had just stood up, knelt down again. Obviously, he finally recognized the emblem on the armor of the two children. It was the emblem of the San Lorenzo family of the Empire. Morley was confused. Why was the royal family here? Colin looked at Morley, who was rolling his eyes, and asked in a light tone, "What's your name?" "My name is Morley. You look like a merchant, right?" Morley nodded honestly. It was actually very easy to distinguish the merchants in this world. They wore luxurious clothes but did not have family badges. They were fat but did not have a noble aura. Especially when they met a real noble, that kind of flattery and humility was engraved in their bones. Seeing Colin's gentle attitude, Morley raised his head and carefully observed the young general in front of him. Then he finally recognized the roaring white bear insignia and quickly asked with a flattering smile, Sir. You must be Count Angeli. I am the president of the Iris Flower Chamber of Commerce in the Eastern region. It is an honor to meet you here." Colin nodded. He was a little surprised. Because the Iris Flower Chamber of Commerce was quite famous in the Eastern region, Colin didn't expect that he would be able to capture the president of this Chamber of Commerce. "Mr. Murray, you are now my captive. What are you going to give me to redeem yourself?" Mo Lee's expression stiffened upon hearing this, but he immediately suppressed his heartache and forced a fawning smile onto his face. "What do you want, Earl? Please give me your orders." "How about this? Help me with one thing and I'll let you go. Please give me your orders. Maury thought that Count Angeli would extort a large sum of money from him, but he did not expect that Angeli would only ask him to do something for him. Maury sighed in relief, but at the same time he became cautious. Obviously, this matter would not be easy to handle. I know that your Iris Flower Chamber of Commerce has a lot of connections in the eastern region, so I want you to spread what happened today. What happened today? You mean? Maury asked cautiously. The Brujan family opened the gate of Tinder City and warmly welcomed the arrival of the Blood Cavalry. Maury blinked his eyes and immediately understood Colin's plan. However, he also understood that this matter was not easy to handle. If something went wrong, the Iris Flower Chamber of Commerce would have to face the double pressure of the Brujan family and the House of St. Prospero. Colin seemed to have seen through Maury's hesitation, so he immediately said with a blank expression, "If this news doesn't spread, then there will be another version." What version? The Iris Flower Chamber of Commerce colluded with the northern frontier and opened the gate of Tinder City. The fat on Maury's body trembled, and he could not help but think of the rumors about the fall of Linshui City. Those half-elf merchants could escape back to Silver Moon City, but he could not. The foundation of the Iris Flower Chamber of Commerce was in the eastern region. If he left this place, his life's work would be completely gone. Should he sacrifice the Brujan family or the Iris Flower Chamber of Commerce? Of course, Maury knew what to choose, so he quickly said, "Count, please rest assured that I will complete the task that you have given me." Colin smiled and patted Maury's head, as if a teacher was praising an obedient student. "Not bad, do a good job." After that, he spurred his horse forward. Maury was left standing alone at the gate of the city. His expression changed for a while, and finally he sighed. At this time, the panic in Tinder City had turned into a strange calm. Needless to say, the people of the eastern region were panicking when the cavalry of the northern frontier charged into the city. But then, the people in the city found that the cavalry of the northern frontier did not start a massacre. It could even be said that they did not offend anyone. Of course, the premise was that you did not resist. As the Tinder army had been destroyed, although there were still many garrison troops in the city gate had been broken. There were only a few people of the eastern region who had the courage to resist the fierce Blood Cavalry. Therefore, after the initial panic, Tinder City regained its calm. After Colin entered the city, he went straight to the castle of the Brujan family. However, when he arrived at the castle, he was surprised to find that the castle gate was open. Moreover, a group of members of the Brujan family were standing at the gate, as if they were welcoming guests from afar. For a moment, Colin almost thought that he was not invading, but had really accepted the invitation of the Brujan family to visit. Just as Colin was wondering, a young man wearing a viscount's suit stepped out of the crowd and said loudly, "Honorable Guardian of the Northern Frontier, Count Angeli, welcome to Tinder City. My father has something to do, so he is unable to welcome you personally. I represent my father to express my sincerest apologies to you." Hearing this, Colin immediately realized that the other party must have misunderstood. They must have thought that the Blood Cavalry bypassed the Tinder army and took advantage of the cavalry's speed to arrive at Tinder City first, and then used a sneak attack to break the city gate. Therefore, the Brujan family put on such a welcoming posture. Firstly, it showed that they were confident enough to remind Colin not to act recklessly. Secondly, it was to buy time for the Tinder army to rush back. Therefore, Colin smiled and said, "You can't represent Count Brujan." The young man was stunned and said, "Count, I forgot to introduce myself. I am the eldest son of Count Brujan, and also the first heir to the family's count title, Green Viscounts. Therefore, when my father is not around, of course I can represent him." "No, you misunderstood me." Colin shook his head with a smile and said, "What I want to say is, Count Brujan is already dead. Why do you represent a dead man?" Father, the dead." Viscount Green squeezed out a few words, as if he was choked by someone. His face was full of disbelief. Colin smiled brightly. "I have kept his body. Do you want to see it?" "Impossible, impossible." Viscount Green seemed to be unable to accept this reality, and kept shaking his head like he was having a stroke. Colin clapped his hands, and 4 soldiers carried a coffin forward. Bang! The coffin landed on the ground. Colin immediately made an inviting gesture and said, "Viscount's Green, take a look for yourself." Chapter 449. With such a coffin placed in front of the castle, the atmosphere seemed to be right again. Colin revealed a satisfied smile and teased, "Viscount's Grim, do you still want to welcome my arrival?" Viscount's Grim's face turned pale. At this time, the Bruggen family's welcoming posture seemed very awkward. Looking at the Viscount's Grim, who clenched his fists, as if he couldn't help but rush over to fight him in the next second, Colin didn't make any defensive posture. Instead, he turned over and dismounted from his horse, slowly walking over to the other party, as if he wanted to present such an opportunity for revenge to the Viscount's Grim. Viscount's Grim began to tremble, not knowing whether it was because of anger or fear. Looking at the enemy who killed his father standing in front of him without any defense, as if he could avenge his father as long as he pulled out his sword and stabbed forward. Viscount's Grim trembled for a long time, but he still didn't pull out his sword. He didn't dare. Colin curled his lips in disdain. Just as he was feeling extremely bored, he suddenly heard a crisp voice. "Since Count Angeli has come to Tinder City, then he is a guest of the Bruggen family, of course we have to welcome him." Colin raised his eyebrows, his gaze went past the Viscount's Grim in front of him, and saw a beautiful girl walking out of the Bruggen family. She was wearing a light green tunic dress, her chestnut-brown hair draped over her smooth shoulders. She was tall and well-proportioned, her delicate facial features still had a hint of youthfulness, but she had a unique charm that was unforgettable. The girl elegantly lifted the hem of her dress, curtsied, and extended her slender hand in front of Colin. She wanted Colin to kiss her hand as a greeting. She really treated him as a visiting guest. Colin gazed at the girl's bright purple eyes with great interest and said with a smile, "If I'm not wrong, you should be the daughter of Count Bruggen, Miss Grace, right?" Grace nodded, her small hand still in front of Colin, as if she wanted him to complete this etiquette. "I just killed your father," Colin kindly reminded her. A trace of sadness flashed through Grace's eyes, but she immediately spoke with a resolute expression. "Dying on the battlefield is the fate of all knights, including my father. It is also an honor that they strive for. The Bruggen family will not hold any grudges against you because of this." Colin laughed heartily, a look of admiration on his face. Compared to the grim Viscounts, who had neither the guts to take revenge nor the ability to hide his anger, Count Bruggen's daughter was much more interesting. Thus, in a very gentlemanly manner, he lifted Grace's slender hand and gently kissed her fingers, saying, "Miss Grace, may your youth last forever and your beauty last forever." When Colin leaned over, he immediately exposed his back to Viscount Grim without any precaution. Viscount Green's hands trembled even more violently. But even after Colin finished kissing his hand, he still didn't move. Grace shot a glance at her brother. It was hard to tell whether her gaze was filled with disappointment or joy. "Sir Count, please move to the living room and taste the flower tea that I personally brewed." Colin took a deep look at the girl. As if suddenly remembering something, he smiled and said, "Oh right, I heard that you are already engaged to the Earl of Avon? Your fiancé is now my captive. Do you want to see him?" "He's gone," Grace said indifferently. Her tone was as if she was discussing a stranger that had nothing to do with her. Then, her delicate face once again bloomed with a charming smile, saying, "Moreover, only the victor has the right to drink the flower tea that I personally brewed." Colin laughed and said, "Then I must taste Miss Grace's flower tea." After saying that, he didn't let the blood cavalry enter the castle to enforce martial law. Instead, he walked in openly. Grace looked at Colin's valiant and heroic back. Her eyes flashed with an indecipherable light. After hesitating for a moment, she finally stepped forward to catch up with him. Naturally, she reached out and held Colin's right arm. She smiled sweetly and said, "Sir Count, I'll lead the way for you." Feeling the warm touch on his arm, Colin's heart swayed. Turning his head, Colin just happened to see the shyness on the girl's cheeks. It was extremely moving. Seeing this scene, Viscount Green's face turned red. Even the acne on the tip of his nose became bright. However, he was just angry and didn't do anything to stop it. Until Colin and his sister's figure gradually went away, Viscount Green suppressed the anger and fear in his heart. He shouted at the servants, "What are you doing? Quickly carry father's body inside." The bright and beautiful afternoon sun passed through the castle's windows and slanted on the spotless oak floor. The spacious living room was plated with a layer of light gold. More than 10 fragrant candles were quietly burning. On top of each cluster of flames, there was a silver disc. The amber on the disc was slowly melting under the temperature of the flames. Wisps of fresh and elegant fragrance gradually filled the air. In the center of the living room, Colin was sitting in a relaxed position on the water lizard leather sofa. He was quietly admiring the girl who was making the flower tea for him. With a focused expression, the girl of the Bruggen family exuded an indescribable temperament. It was like the ice and snow on the peak of Alsace. Pure and beautiful, but also 1,000 miles away. "Sir Count, your flower tea." Grace put the tray on the table. Her fair little hand picked up a cup of emerald green flower tea. However, she didn't directly hand the cup to Colin. Instead, she brought it to her mouth and took a sip. Then, she brought it to Colin. Looking at the bright red lipstick mark on the silver teacup, Colin smiled. He reached out to take it and brought it to his mouth. Whether it was intentional or not, Colin's lips just happened to touch the spot where the lipstick mark was. The moment he took a sip, there was a faint bitterness. Then, there was a light and pleasant fragrance that penetrated his heart and spleen. His body felt refreshed both inside and outside. Putting down the teacup, Colin saw that the face of the girl in front of him was already flushed with shyness. However, the words that came out of her mouth were poles apart from her harmless appearance. "Sir Count, aren't you worried that the tea is poisoned?" Colin's expression didn't change. He chuckled and said, "Didn't you drink it first? But I might have already taken the antidote." Grace winked playfully, trying to find a trace of fear on Colin's face. Unfortunately, she was disappointed. This Count of the Northern Frontier really seemed to be fearless. "If I can return to the Lord's embrace with Miss Grace, then the journey won't be lonely." Seemingly provoked by such explicit words, the blush on Grace's face became even more obvious. She snorted and said angrily, "Sir Count, now I finally understand why the half-elf queen is willing to be your lover and even give birth to a daughter for you." Colin drank another mouthful of flower tea. He looked at the girl in front of him with a smile and said, "What? Do you want to learn from her?" Grace coquettishly glanced at Colin. In that instant, she revealed a flirtatious expression. Like a blooming snow lotus, she was elegant and peerless, yet extremely charming. Colin was an experienced driver, so of course, he understood the meaning of the girl's gaze. He chuckled and continued speaking. "As long as you do one thing, you can become my lover." Grace also seemed to understand Colin's meaning. She shyly lowered her head and softly said, "What is it?" Colin stretched out his index finger and hooked the girl's chin, turning her gaze back to him. "I want you to kill your fiancé, Earl of Avon." Chapter 450. The living room suddenly quieted down. Grace also suddenly froze, her bright and beautiful purple eyes filled with shock and fear. Obviously, she did not expect Colin's request to be this. "What? You don't dare?" Colin withdrew his finger and did not hide his disappointment. Grace smiled bitterly and said in a coquettish tone, "Earl, that is the son of the Duke of St. Prospero. You are worried about the revenge of the House of St. Prospero?" "Yes." Grace nodded without hesitation. Colin smiled playfully and said, "But even if you don't kill the Earl of Avon, the Duke of St. Prospero will not let the Bruggen family off." Grace obviously misunderstood Colin's meaning and explained, "The Duke of St. Prospero will not blame the Bruggen family for the defeat of the Fire Velvet Army. Moreover, my father has already sacrificed himself heroically on the battlefield. He did not violate his oath." "No, of course the Duke of St. Prospero will not blame the Bruggen family for the defeat of the Fire Velvet Army. But what if the Bruggen family opens the gates of Fire Velvet City and surrenders to the Blood Cavalry? Colin then told Grace about the meeting he had with the president of the Iris Flower Chamber of Commerce at the city gates and what he had asked him to do. Grace's eyes widened. She did not expect Colin to use such a method to slander the Bruggen family. However, she had no choice but to admit that such slanderous words were easier to believe. After all, compared to the fantasy of the 50,000 Fire Velvet army being wiped out by the 3,000 Blood Cavalry and the Fire Velvet city being conquered in an instant, it was more reasonable for the Bruggen family to betray the eastern region and surrender to the northern frontier. Grace was sure that when such a rumor reached the ears of the Duke of St. Prospero, the Bruggen family would not be as trusted as before, even if she continued to marry the Earl of Avon. The geographical location of Tinder City was too important. Even if there was only a sliver of possibility that the Bruggen family would betray them, the Duke of St. Prospero would definitely take thunderous measures to eliminate this hidden danger. When Colin saw Grace's complexion constantly changing, he knew that she had figured this out. He smiled and said, "How about it? Do you dare to kill the Earl of Avon now?" Grace fell into silence. Colin wasn't in a hurry. He continued to savor the flower tea with a leisurely look on his face. When the tea was finished, Grace finally opened her mouth. "My lord, I think a living Earl of Avon would be more useful to you." He still didn't dare to. Of course, perhaps it was because he was unwilling. Colin stared into Grace's eyes and asked, "Why?" Grace poured another cup of scented tea for Colin. She deliberated for a moment before speaking. She deliberated and said, "My lord, forgive me for speaking bluntly. Although your bloody cavalry is invincible, there are too few of them. They can conquer but can't defend. And because the invasion of the orcs is imminent, you can't mobilize the northern frontier army to invade the eastern region. So, you are destined to give up all the cities in the eastern region that you have conquered, right?" Colin nodded and used his eyes to signal for Grace to continue. Grace felt a little more confident as she continued, "But your lordship, if we return without any results, I'm sure you won't be willing. Especially a strategic place like Tinder City. Anyone who wants to get a share of the eastern region will not be willing to give it up easily. So, my suggestion is that you can use the Earl of Avon to form a puppet regime north of the Alxis Mountains. The Bruggen family will help you block the pass to the south of the Alxis Mountains. As for the lords of the eastern region north of the Alxis Mountains, I believe that after they hear that you have wiped out the Fire Velvet army in one battle, they will certainly be terrified and will not dare to be enemies with the Blood Cavalry. At this time, you can push out the Earl of Avon, the direct descendant of the Paladin family. Those lords will definitely follow the trend and pledge their loyalty to Evan. In this way, you can control half of the eastern region by controlling the Earl of Avon." Colin smiled faintly and said, "Sounds good. But there is a problem." "What problem?" "I don't trust Evan. This kid has too many ideas and is not easy to control." Glacé hurriedly said, "I can help you. You can leave Evan in Tinder City and 3,000 bloody cavalry. I can assure you that the House of St. Prospero will not be able to reach the north of the Alxis Mountains." Colin still shook his head, "But I don't trust you either." "But..." Grace pouted her rosy lips and said unwillingly, "You can trust the half-elf queen. Why can't you trust me? I can do what she can do." With that, the girl gritted her teeth and sat on Colin's lap. She put her hands on Colin's chest and put on a very charming posture. Colin's heart skipped a beat and he subconsciously reached out to hold the girl's slender waist. Feeling the warm and fragrant breath and the burning eyes, Colin's heart could not help but beat faster. However, Grace's slightly stiff body still revealed the restlessness in her heart. This was probably the first time such an intimate body contact had happened to this young girl. Colin smiled faintly, his hands gently patting the girl's waist to help her relax, but the words that came out of his mouth were merciless. "How do you expect me to trust a person whose father I just killed?" Grace's body, which had just relaxed a little, stiffened again. That's right. The hatred of killing one's father was irreconcilable. Grace bit her red lips so hard that they were almost dripping blood. She looked at Colin with eyes full of resentment. It was as if she was blaming Colin for revealing the bloody truth so heartlessly. "Then what do I have to do for you to trust me?" Grace's voice had a hint of sobbing. Colin hugged the sorrowful girl in his arms, but his heart was as firm as stone. Of course, he would not be so easily fooled by her appearance. Until now, he still did not know what this daughter of Count Bruggen was planning. But no matter how she acted, Colin would not trust her as long as she did not show any proof of her allegiance. Didn't I already say? As long as you kill the Earl of Avon, I can trust you. Colin reached out and caressed the girl's white and delicate neck. I don't dare to kill someone from the house of St. Prospero. Grace mistakenly thought that she still had room to bargain, so she pressed her body against his. But in reality, Colin was only hesitating on whether or not to turn Grace into a blood-kin. The scene in the village near Linchue City reminded Colin that even a blood-kin might not be completely loyal. He was still observing the performance of the other blood-kin, Marquis Vincent. He hoped to see if Marquis Vincent would still be absolutely loyal to him in a situation where there was a serious conflict of interest. Before coming to a conclusion, Colin did not want to create another unstable factor. Of course, if Grace was willing to kill the Earl of Avon, then Colin would definitely trust her. Because at that time, what would prevent Grace from betraying him would not only be the fetters of the blood kin, but also the collusion of interests. Grace looked at Colin's eyes, which were gradually turning cold, and the hope in her heart was gradually extinguished. She steeled her heart and pressed her tender red lips against his. Colin did not dodge. But just as he was savoring the girl's youthfulness and fragrance, a light cough came from outside the living room. Scram! The messenger outside the door was so frightened that he trembled. He immediately knew that he had come at the wrong time, but when he thought of the importance of this news, he still reported in a loud voice. Sir Count, St. Prospero Evan has been rescued. Chapter 451. What? Colin finally broke free from the softness, strode to the door of the living room, and asked in a deep voice, "What's going on?" "Sir, just now, a powerful female knight suddenly rushed into the city, killed several people, and rescued St. Prospero. We are searching for their whereabouts in the city." "Female knight?" "Yes, sir. She's wearing gorgeous armor and holding a huge broadsword. It's said that she's a powerful fifth-step knight. It should be Miss Anna St. Prospero." Grace also came over with a blush on her face. It was hard to tell whether it was regret or relief in her expression. But no matter what, since the Earl of Avon was rescued, she did not have to kill a St. Prospero with her own hands. Grace quietly breathed a sigh of relief. Anna St. Prospero? Colin repeated the name and couldn't help but think of the valiant female knight he saw in Silver Moon City 2 years ago. At that time, she left a deep impression on Colin. He didn't expect to meet her again. But why did the youngest daughter of the Duke of St. Prospero come to Tinder City at this time? Is she alone? Colin asked again. Evan was rescued by a woman? Colin resisted the urge to curse. Because he knew that he couldn't blame his subordinates for being too careless. After all, the blood cavalry had just entered the city and was busy stabilizing the situation in the city. Coupled with the serious lack of military strength, they really couldn't guard the Earl of Avon strictly. Continue to search and find them both. Yes. The messenger immediately took the order and left. However, Colin didn't have much hope. First of all, with the strength of the blood cavalry, it was impossible to search the entire city wantonly. Moreover, he couldn't stay in Tinder City for long. Continuing to march south to White Dew City was his real purpose. It seemed that the Earl of Avon was destined to slip away from his hands. Fortunately, this didn't affect Colin's original plan too much. However, for this Grace before him, "Are you relieved?" Colin turned around and looked at the girl with a teasing expression. Grace nodded honestly and said, "That's right. Whether it's his identity as a direct descendant of the House of St. Prospero or my fiancé, it's hard for me to do anything to him." Colin shrugged and said, "Then you've lost a precious opportunity." After saying this, Colin strode out without any hesitation. "Your lordship," Grace pitifully called out from behind, as if she was a pitiful girl who had just been abandoned by a scumbag. Colin turned around and smiled politely. "Miss Grace, without the Earl of Avon, You and I will not have the opportunity to build trust. Therefore, I will continue to be your father's murderer." Grace puffed up her chest and bit her red lips. She said pitifully, "Is there no other way for you to trust me?" Colin shook his head firmly. He wasn't an animal who thought with his lower body. He wouldn't easily change his principles for beauty. If Grace could prove her sincerity and complete the binding of interests with the northern frontier, then Colin wouldn't mind having one more lover in Tinder City. Especially if it was a pretty girl. But now, Colin didn't want to complicate matters. Seeing that Colin wasn't moved, Grace immediately said, "Please wait a moment." Colin didn't intend to continue entangling with this girl. But when he saw the movement of Grace's hand from the corner of his eye, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. He saw her slender hand raised to her chest with her palm facing inwards. Her fingers were intertwined, forming a lotus-like handprint. This handprint? Colin had seen it before. Just half a year ago in Imperial Dragon City, when he and Empress Medela were honest with each other and formed an alliance, Empress Medela had told him that if he saw this handprint again, it would be someone he could trust. Of course, Colin didn't have much trust in Empress Medela herself. But when he found out that the Brujan family was actually a chess piece of the Imperial family in the eastern region, his interest was immediately piqued. "I suddenly want to taste your flower tea again." Grace smiled sweetly and said, "It's my honor." The two returned to the living room and sat down. It was the same flower tea, the same fragrance, the same girl who brewed the tea, but the atmosphere was completely different. Colin took the silver teacup Grace brought over and took a sip. He closed his eyes and savored the taste for a while. He opened his eyes again and said, "Were you testing me just now?" Grace shook her head in grievance and said, "Why would I test you? Then why didn't you reveal your identity at the beginning?" "Because I wasn't sure if you were an ally of Her Highness the Empress. Didn't she tell you that I was a member of the Alliance?" "The Empress didn't tell me about any of the Alliance members. I just saw that you were targeting the Eastern region and guessed that you might be an ally of Her Highness the Empress, so I made this handprint to test it out." Colin was stunned. He realized that although Empress Medela had told him about this handprint and the existence of such an alliance, she had never mentioned any of the alliance members. Originally, Colin thought that this was because the Empress was wary of him, but now it seemed that he wasn't treated specially. The other alliance members also didn't know of each other's existence, they only knew of the Empress. Therefore, Empress Medela became the key person to maintain this alliance. Without her, no one would be able to recognize their allies. Grace looked at Colin, who was deep in thought and couldn't help but ask, "Sir Count, what are you thinking about?" Colin raised his head and asked the question in his heart, "Since the Brujan family is an ally of the Empress, why did the Fire Velvet Army fight to the death with me?" Grace slowly shook her head and said, "Sir Count, you misunderstood. Father shouldn't be an ally of the Empress. In the Brujan family, I'm afraid that I'm the only one." Colin thought about it carefully and felt that this was indeed the case. If Empress Medela could already control Count Brujan, or even the entire Brujan family, then the royal family wouldn't have to be so afraid of the eastern region. One must know that with the important position of Fire Velvet City and the powerful fighting strength of the Fire Velvet Army, they could easily divide the eastern region into two. Plus, with the royal family fanning the flames, it wouldn't be difficult for the eastern region to fall into civil strife. Thinking of this, Colin asked again, "Since the Brujan family is still loyal to the House of St. Prospero, then why are you willing to serve Empress Medela?" Grace didn't answer this question, but asked in return, "Sir Count, why are you willing to ally with Her Highness the Empress?" "She has something on me," Colin thought to himself. But then he came to a realization. "So that's why." Colin suddenly laughed and said, "Miss Grace, what does Her Highness the Empress have on you?" Chapter 452. How to Establish Trust. Different people had different solutions to this problem. Empress Medela's method was to exchange secrets with each other and use them as leverage. Since Grace could become Empress Medela's ally, it meant that this seemingly innocent girl actually had a fatal leverage in the Empress' hands. With leverage, they would have a way to restrain each other and would not betray each other. Of course, the premise was that this leverage had to be true. Colin had played a trick last time, but he later realized that Empress Medela was not honest either. Sigh, they were all old silver coins. They exchanged loneliness. However, if it was about Grace, Colin felt that this young girl might not be able to deceive Empress Medela like he did. That was why he asked the question just now. Grace glanced at Colin, but hesitated and did not speak. Colin picked up the teacup and drank the flower tea in one gulp. Originally, when Earl of Avon ran away, you lost the chance to gain my trust. But now, there's a new opportunity in front of you. What are you hesitating for? Grace poured another cup of tea for Colin and probed, My Lord Count, when I first formed an alliance with Her Highness the Empress, Her Highness used her own secrets to exchange with me. I wonder if you... Colin smiled faintly and said, Of course. I'll tell you the leverage I gave Empress Medela back then. Grace clearly did not expect Colin to be so easy to talk to. She immediately perked up and nodded repeatedly. My weakness is that Charles St. Hilda was killed by me. Colin handed over his leverage without blushing or skipping a beat. Grace could not hide the shock in her heart. She was unwilling to kill the Earl of Avon because she was afraid that she would be tainted with the blood of a direct descendant of the Paladin family. But she did not expect this person in front of her to. Moreover, Charles was his wife's brother. Grace really wanted to ask Colin, Don't you feel guilty when facing your wife at night? However, from the beginning to the end, Grace had never considered the possibility of Colin lying to her. In her opinion, since Colin was able to use this secret to gain Empress Medela's trust, then of course it was true. Looking at the wide-eyed Grace, Colin raised his hand and made an inviting gesture. It's your turn. Grace took a few deep breaths and calmed her heart. She then asked a question. Count, do you know why I wasn't too grieved when I learned that you had killed Count Bruggen? Colin's heart stirred. Indeed, Grace's behavior was somewhat strange. Originally, Colin thought that the other party was pretending to be strong, feigning civility with the enemy who killed his father, and looking for an opportunity to assassinate and take revenge. However, Colin had already given her so many excellent opportunities to assassinate him, yet Grace had done nothing. If she was that cowardly Viscount's Grim, it would have been fine if she didn't dare, but to be so calm after learning of her father's death, Grace clearly had enough courage. Moreover, from their interactions during this period of time, Colin felt that rather than avenging her father, Grace was more tirelessly trying to gain Colin's trust. If it wasn't for the fear of staining her hands with the blood of a direct descendant of the Holy Knight family, Grace would probably be willing to kill her own fiancé to prove her loyalty. This wasn't how a young girl should act when facing the enemy who killed her father. But, did Count Bruggen not treat you well? Colin thought, can't it be a ghost? Is it a father's melodramatic story? Grace shook her head and said, No, my father treated me very well. He doted on me and treated me as if I were his own. Treated you as if you were his own? Colin was just about to ask if she knew how to use words, but then he reacted. Could it be that Count Bruggen isn't your biological father? Grace nodded, confirming Colin's guess. Colin hurriedly asked, Then who is your biological father? And how did the Empress know about this secret? Grace revealed a look of reminiscence, and then she narrated tirelessly. 5 years ago, I followed my father to Imperial Dragon City to attend His Majesty's birthday celebration. That was also the first time I met Empress Medela. As soon as we met, Her Highness the Empress didn't hide her fondness for me and even offered to personally teach me court etiquette. Lord Count, you should know that this was actually a hint for me to marry into the royal family. My father was very surprised. Although he knew that with my status, it was unlikely that I would marry Prince Harrison, even if I could marry a collateral member of the San Lorenzo family, it would still be a great honor for the Bruggen family. So that night, my father sent me to the Empress' side for me to be taught. But after my father left, the Empress suddenly told me that I wasn't Count Bruggen's biological daughter. At that time, I was scared silly and didn't dare to refute the Empress, but I also didn't believe her words. But the Empress told me to go back and ask my mother, saying that I would get the answer from her. When I came back, I immediately went to find my mother and told her what the Empress said, hoping to get a negative answer from her. Unfortunately, my mother's expression changed greatly and she had to admit that the Empress was right. I really wasn't Count Bruggen's daughter. Then whose daughter are you? Colin couldn't help but ask. Grace shook her head, her eyes full of confusion. I don't know either. I asked my mother, but she wouldn't tell me. I also asked the Empress, but she wouldn't tell me either. She just wanted to reassure me that she wouldn't tell this secret to anyone else. And to reassure me, she even shared a secret of her own. After that, I became increasingly close to Empress Medela. Not only did she teach me court etiquette, she also told me a lot of things, including the open and covert struggles between the royal family and the church. She even confessed that I was a chess piece she had placed in the eastern region and that I would be of great use in the future. I stayed in Phoenix Palace for a whole year before returning to the eastern region. Before I left, Empress Medela told me that someone would contact me in the future. So, when you appeared in Tinder City, I thought it was you. The Empress didn't tell me about your existence. Colin shook his head. Then he thought of Emperor Reinhardt, who liked to cheat on his vassals and couldn't help but guess. Could you be His Majesty's illegitimate daughter? But as soon as he said that, Colin immediately denied his guess. No, I don't think so. Emperor Reinhardt cheated on his vassals openly. Grace nodded in agreement. Indeed, if she really was the emperor's illegitimate daughter, she would have been kept in captivity in the imperial capital. Count Bruggen wouldn't have been unaware and foolishly raised her as his own daughter for so long. Then what about your mother? Colin asked again. Mother has passed away. Grace's expression was gloomy. Well, another clue had been cut off. Then which family did your mother belong to? St. Ronners. The Lord of the Southern Region? Colin was a little surprised. But my mother was a collateral descendant of the St. Ronners family. Colin was silent. He didn't know much about the Southern Region, so he couldn't infer anything just based on this. Shaking his head, Colin decided not to go around this dead end anymore. Instead, he asked, by the way, what was the secret that Empress Medela exchanged with you? When he asked this question, Colin didn't pay too much attention to it because he guessed that Grace would get a lie similar to, I am Vera's biological mother. But unexpectedly, Grace's answer startled Colin. Her Royal Highness told me that Prince Harrison and Princess Judy are not the children of Emperor Reinhardt. Chapter 453. What the hell? Colin's eyes widened. Apparently, he did not expect to get such an answer. Looking at Colin's expression, Grace seemed to realize something and immediately asked, is this not the secret that Her Highness told you? Colin secretly rolled his eyes and then came to a realization. How could the Empress' words be trusted? The so-called secret she had given Grace was probably the same as the secret Colin had received. They were both lies from head to toe. Do you think the Empress is telling the truth about this secret? Colin didn't answer Grace's question and instead asked a question of his own. Her Highness wouldn't lie about this kind of thing, would she? Grace said thoughtfully. Moreover, during the year I stayed at Phoenix Palace, I did notice that Emperor Reinhardt didn't particularly care about Prince Harrison and Princess Judy. Moreover, I think that His Majesty is also aware of this, which is why he gave birth to a bunch of illegitimate children outside. Colin rubbed his chin and found that Grace's words were indeed reasonable. When Emperor Reinhardt sent Harrison and Judy to the northern frontier, Colin felt that it was strange. Even if it was for the sake of becoming a disciple, there was no need to send his only 2 children out. If Colin fell out with the royal family, wouldn't Harrison and Judy become hostages? Also, Emperor Reinhardt's hobby of cuckolding his subordinates was indeed very much like a form of revenge against the Empress, but then Colin laughed inwardly, realizing that he had almost been fooled by the Empress again. At first, he had believed the Empress' claim that she was Vera's biological mother because there were many seemingly reasonable clues to prove this matter. But none of these clues were ironclad evidence. Later, Marquis Garcia had personally denied the Empress' claim. Therefore, Colin dared to conclude that the Empress' secret, in Grace's possession, must also be a lie. How could a cunning politician like Empress Medela really hand over her own fatal weakness? Not to mention handing it over to a young girl like Grace. The Bruggen family was indeed important, but not to this extent. Even if Grace's background was slightly mysterious, it would never be enough for Empress Medela to pay such a price to win her over. Emperor Reinhardt's attitude towards Harrison and Judy was indeed strange, and his well-known eccentricities did seem to imply something, but this was certainly not because the Empress had cuckolded him. Otherwise, how could Emperor Reinhardt, who held the highest authority of the Empire of Light, tolerate Empress Medela? This was the most important issue of bloodline. Even if Empress Medela was born in the House of Saint, it was impossible for the royal family's tolerance on this issue. What are you thinking about? Seeing Colin remain silent, Grace couldn't help but ask. It's nothing. Of course, Colin wouldn't tell Grace about the secret Empress Medela had given him. Although it was also a lie, Vera's background was indeed suspicious. Colin did not intend to tell this secret of the House of St. Hilda to an outsider like Grace. Grace knew that Colin was hiding something from her, but she did not dare to ask. In the current situation, she was obviously the weaker party, and the one who needed help. Ever since she found out that she was not the biological daughter of Count Bruggen, Grace had a strong sense of crisis. When she first found out that she was about to marry the Earl of Avon, Grace was extremely conflicted. On one hand, she also wanted to marry into the House of St. Prospero and have more power. That way, even if her background was exposed, she would have room to maneuver. But on the other hand, she was worried that her behavior would be seen as a betrayal by Empress Medela. After all, she was very clear about the conflict between the royal family and the eastern region. She also knew that she was actually a chess piece placed in the eastern region by Empress Medela. This kind of dilemma caused Grace to act strangely when she saw Colin, who had killed his way into the city. Others thought that Colin was her father's murderer, but in fact, in Grace's eyes, Colin was her savior and an opportunity. Sir Count, now that we've exchanged our secrets, will you be able to trust me? Grace lightly bit her red lips and asked with a bashful expression. Colin was naturally able to understand Grace's hint. He extended his hand and pinched the girl's smooth chin, smiling as he said, I think that if I can understand you more deeply, this trust will be even stronger. Grace's delicate face turned bright red, but she still firmly stuck to him. The girl's fragrant scent wafted over, and Colin could even feel her gradually rising body temperature and her pounding heart. So, he no longer hesitated and lowered his head to hug Grace tightly in his arms. This time, there were no blind attendants who came to disturb them. The next morning, Colin opened his eyes and saw Grace's pretty face. The girl in his arms had yet to awaken, and the soft and smooth feeling made him reluctant to move his hands away. After a night of intimacy, how could the immature Grace be a match for a veteran like Colin? It didn't take long for her to be beaten to a pulp, crying and begging for mercy. Although bullying a little girl wasn't the conduct of a gentleman, Colin couldn't help but admit that last night, no matter if it was mentally or physically, he had obtained great satisfaction. Perhaps Colin's small actions had alarmed Grace, but the girl let out a moan and slowly woke up. Feeling Colin's mischievous hands, Grace, who had yet to recover from last night's torrential rain, was so frightened that she hurriedly made a begging expression. Colin wasn't the kind of person who didn't know how to take care of girls. He smiled and said, Okay, I won't bully you anymore. Get up. Grace beamed and even gave Colin a sweet morning kiss. Then, she quickly got up and picked up the clothes on the ground. While putting them on, Grace said to Colin, Colin, what do you plan to do next? I will continue to go south and march into White Dew City. Colin also got up from the bed, put on his clothes and said, I will leave after breakfast. In such a hurry? Grace seemed to be reluctant to part with him. Are you really going to attack White Dew City? I still feel that it's not a good idea. Colin smiled and said proudly, If a day ago, when I told you that I was going to use 3,000 blood cavalry to attack 50,000 Tinder army, would you think it was a good idea? Grace was speechless. For Colin, who was good at creating miracles on the battlefield, she felt that any words of persuasion were somewhat pale and powerless. But Grace still tried to persuade him, I just feel that it would be safer to first defend Tinder City and then take over half of the eastern region north of the Alsace Mountains. I know you are unwilling, but you have to be patient and have confidence in me. Colin looked into Grace's eyes and said seriously, After getting along with each other, Colin had realized that although Grace was young and immature, she also had a lot of ambition. Of course, Colin didn't mind his lover having ambition, as long as she was obedient. Grace saw the determination in Colin's eyes and could only nod. Okay, then what do you want me to do? Not for the time being. Colin stepped forward and held the girl's shoulder. Be patient and don't always think about this little place north of the Alsace Mountains. In my eyes, the entire eastern region will be mine sooner or later. Feeling Colin's strong confidence, Grace's heart surged and she once again took the initiative to kiss him. The clothes that she had just put on slipped off again. Chapter 454. When Colin held Grace's hand and walked into the dining hall, they immediately attracted everyone's attention. Although it was said to be everyone, there were actually only 3 people: Prince Harrison, Princess Judy, and the current head of the Bruggon family, Viscount Grimm. As for the maids and servants in the dining hall, they did not dare to stare at Colin and Grace. Of course, someone as thick-skinned as Colin would not care about other people's gazes, but the girl beside him could not help but lower her head shyly. However, her hands were still wrapped around Colin's arm, and she did not let go. Originally, Viscount Grimm was using an extremely flattering posture to get close to Prince Harrison, and no one knew what he was saying. Now that he saw his father's murderer walk in, the Viscount Grimm immediately shut his mouth. But then, his gaze was fixed on his sister, who was radiant like a flower bud blooming after the spring rain, and the expression on his face became extremely complicated: anger, shame, hatred, jealousy, and he also thought that if this matter were to reach the ears of the House of St. Prospero, then wouldn't the marriage between his sister and the Earl of Avon be ruined? However, when Colin's gaze turned over, the Viscount Grimm immediately lowered his head as if he had been electrocuted, and focused on the food in front of him, as if he would not have to face the cruel reality by doing so. Greetings, teacher. Prince Harrison and Princess Judy stood up and bowed, their faces full of mischievous smiles. Colin smiled and nodded at the 2 students, and then sat down at the main seat. The maids at the side immediately brought in cutlery and napkins. The long table was filled with a sumptuous breakfast: stewed grouse with mushrooms, steamed white salmon, grilled steak, cream pies, white bread, milk, and some vegetables and nuts. The Bruggon family's chef was very good at cooking. The color of the food was enticing, and the aroma was overflowing, which whetted Colin's appetite. After drinking a mouthful of milk, Colin opened his mouth to speak to the Viscount Grimm, who was hiding at the side and pretending to be invisible. Viscount Grimm, in about 2 hours, the Blood Cavalry will leave Tinder City. You can also prepare. Viscount Grimm tried his best to suppress the humiliation in his heart. He forced a smile on his face and said, "All right, Count Angeli. I'll prepare a grand farewell ceremony for you." Farewell ceremony? Colin was stunned for a moment before he shook his head and said, "No, you misunderstood. I want you to prepare your own luggage and come with us later." Viscount Grimm was dumbfounded. After regaining his senses, the young Viscounts began to tremble again. He didn't know if it was because of fear or anger. "What? You're not happy?" Colin raised his eyebrows. Viscount Grimm trembled even more violently, as if he was having a stroke. The knife and fork in his hand knocked against the plate, making clanking sounds. "Poochie!" Princess Judy couldn't help but cover her mouth and snicker. Apparently, she was amused by Viscount Grimm's appearance. Viscount Grimm took a few deep breaths and tried to adjust his state of mind. Only then did the trembling of his body slightly lessen. But when he opened his mouth, he still revealed his fear. "What do you mean? What else can it mean?" Colin's heart also despised this cowardly Viscount to the extreme. His tone also became impolite. "Now that you're my captive, do you still want to continue to stay in Tinder City?" "Captive? Captive?" Viscount Grimm's face turned pale in an instant. He then pointed at Grace and said without thinking, "You can take my sister away." Hearing this, Grace didn't even raise her head and continued to elegantly cut the beef on the plate. Colin sneered and said, "Viscount Grimm, pushing your sister out as a captive? Is this your responsibility as a knight and as the patriarch of the Bruggon family?" Isn't she already your lover? Viscount Green shouted. I still have to stay and preside over the overall situation of Tinder City. And if I go with you, then who will inherit the Bridgen family's title? Colin rolled his eyes and said in a bad mood, I don't care who inherits the Bridgen family's title, now I just want to take my captive away. After saying that, he no longer paid attention to Viscount Green, who was still shouting. He reached out his hand and clapped heavily twice. Then 3 blood cavalry soldiers walked in. Colin waved his hand, as if he was driving away a fly. Viscount Green is too slow to pack up, you guys go and help him speed up. Earl, I'm willing to pledge my loyalty to you, I'm willing to pledge my loyalty to you. Sister, help me beg Earl Angeli, help me. No matter how Viscount Green begged for mercy, Colin looked indifferent. Grace also didn't say anything, as if she didn't hear her brother's cry for help. The poor Viscount Green was forcibly dragged out by the blood cavalry soldiers just like that. That embarrassing appearance made the Bridgen family's attendants couldn't help but lament in their hearts. Earl Bridgen was also a person of importance, but how could he have such a useless son? Princess Judy looked at this scene with great interest. Suddenly, she moved to Grace's ear and whispered a few words. Then, the two began to chatter, and no one knew what they were discussing. Colin glanced at the two, and didn't find it strange. After all, Grace had once stayed in Phoenix Palace for a whole year, so it wasn't strange that she was familiar with Princess Judy. Although Prince Harrison was very curious about what his sister and Grace were discussing, he didn't dare to ask when he saw Grace's face that was as red as a ripe apple. He could only focus on eating the food in front of him. Colin stuffed the last piece of steak into his mouth and drank all the milk. He picked up the napkin to wipe his mouth, and stood up, saying, Harrison, Judy, hurry up and pack up after you two are done eating. We're about to set off. Yes, teacher. Prince Harrison immediately responded. Princess Judy smiled and asked, Teacher, is Sister Grace really not coming with us? Colin shook his head and said, Grace has other things to do. All right. Princess Judy pouted unhappily, as if she really wanted Grace to replace that boring and annoying Viscount Green. Seeing Colin walk out, Grace hurriedly put down her knife and fork and got up to follow him. Colin waited for her to come up and asked, After I leave, you should be able to control the situation in Tinder City, right? Grace nodded eagerly. As long as Green isn't around, I'm the first in line to inherit the Bridgen family's title. No one can challenge my position. But then, she said hesitantly, But I'm afraid the Duke of St. Prospero might not be willing to give me the title so easily. Colin smiled confidently and said, Don't worry, I'll make him willing. But Grace smiled sweetly and hugged her lover's arm. Chapter 455. The south gate of Tinder City opened wide, and a group of blood cavalry galloped out, raising smoke and dust that covered the sky. The guards of the Bridgen family looked at this scene, and they felt that it was unreal. This group of cavalry from the northern frontier came quickly and left quickly, as if they didn't have the slightest bit of nostalgia for Tinder City, which was known as the #1 fortress in the eastern region. However, they all understood that although the blood cavalry came and went like the wind, and only stayed in Tinder City for a day and a night, they had already completely changed the city. The rumors about Grace and Count Angeli were already circulating in the city, and this kind of news could always spread effortlessly, not to mention that the Bridgen family didn't seem to have the intention of blocking the news. Therefore, where Tinder City should go in the future became the most private topic of discussion in the city. Grace stood on the city wall, not caring about the various probing gazes coming from the surroundings, and looking at the blood cavalry gradually disappearing into the horizon. She was lost in thought. The butler walked over and asked softly, Miss, those rumors in the city, should we do something about it? No need. Grace shook her head. The butler frowned, and just as he was about to persuade again, he heard Grace say again, Go and contact the church, let them prepare for Father's funeral. Yes. The butler could only accept the order with a heart full of worries and left. The cold wind whistled, and the guards on the city wall unconsciously shrank their necks. However, the pampered and spoiled Miss Grace was still standing there quietly, looking into the distance as if she was waiting for something. There was not a trace of cloud in the clear sky, and it was as clean as a blue mirror. Suddenly, an almost undetectable black dot appeared on the mirror, hovering over Tinder City. Grace's gaze focused, and her small cherry mouth formed a strange shape, and a sharp whistle was constantly emitted. Attracted by the whistle, the black dot in the sky suddenly swooped down. When it was close, it was discovered that it was actually a huge black feather raven. The raven landed on Grace's shoulder and very humanely rubbed the girl's hair with its wings, as if it was greeting her. Grace smiled and rubbed Raven's head. Then, she took a letter from Raven's leg. The guards on the city wall curiously peeked at the girl and the strangely shaped raven from the corner of their eyes, but they didn't dare to approach and ask. Finally, Grace finished reading the letter. Her face still had the same expression as before, as if the contents of the letter didn't surprise her at all. After that, she took out a written reply letter from her bosom and tied it to the raven's leg. Once again, she let out a sharp whistle. The raven cawed, flapped its black wings, and flew back into the sky, quickly disappearing. Grace turned around and walked down the tower. When she passed by a brazier, she threw the letter she had just received into it. The rising flames quickly engulfed the letter, spitting out ashes. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind blew, and the corner of the letter that had not yet been completely burned rolled out of the brazier. The guard at the side hurriedly picked it up and saw that there was only a signature left on it. "Your dearest brother." The guard scratched his head in confusion. Didn't Miss Grace's brother just leave Tinder City? Why did he write a letter back? But he didn't dare to ask more, and hurriedly threw it back into the brazier. The flames rose again, completely turning the corner of the letter into ashes. "You are the black cavalry galloping on the battlefield. Speed is your second life." Clive felt the cold wind whistling past his ears, and couldn't help but recall Marquis Garcia's admonition on the command platform when the black cavalry was just established. At that time, the black cavalry galloping on the firmament ice field was indeed carrying out this creed, to win with speed. Under the leadership of Marquis Garcia, the black cavalry were like a red-hot steel knife. No matter when or where, they could pierce the enemy's chest in the shortest time, with the fastest speed, and with the most ferocious posture, making their blood boil immediately. Battle after battle, victory after victory, the black cavalry used the enemy's blood and undefeated battle record to polish this name brighter and brighter, more and more glorious. However, after the fiasco in the Shadow Canyon, Marquis Garcia left the black cavalry. This army also had a new commander, a new name, and a new style. Compared with Marquis Garcia's straightforwardness, Count Angeli's style made many black cavalry soldiers very uncomfortable at first. They were all veteran generals who had been on the battlefield for a long time. Of course, it was impossible for them to not understand the situation, and they could all understand some simple strategies. If the tactics and strategies of Marquis Garcia in the past were relatively easy to understand, that is, to find the enemy's most fatal point and then kill with the fastest speed and the most decisive posture. Then, Count Angeli's style seemed somewhat unpredictable, and could even be called strange and unpredictable. But there was one thing that Count Angeli and Marquis Garcia had in common, that was, they were both invincible. Outside Silvermoon City, the remnants of the 7,000 black cavalry wiped out the 100,000 Pegasus Legion, ran thousands of miles on the sky ice field, and cut off the head of the Troll Emperor outside the Troll King City. When the northern frontier was in danger of falling into civil strife, he turned the tide with his own strength and led the army to defeat the seemingly large number of rebels, although it was hard for officers like Clive to figure out Count Angeli's thoughts. Count Angeli's reputation in the army was no less than Marquis Cash's because of the victories that Count Angeli had won over and over again. Therefore, when Count Angeli asked the main force of blood cavalry to go down the New Shui River and set off for White Dew City outside Alfalfa City, no one questioned. Clive now recalled that he felt that he was crazy at that time. Less than 20,000 blood cavalry went deep into the hinterland of the eastern region alone, and their target was a strong city like White Dew City. No one would think that it was possible for them to take down White Dew City alone, but strangely, no one doubted that Count Angeli could lead them to take down White Dew City. It sounded difficult to understand, but this was the role of prestige. As long as there was enough prestige, a commander could let his army execute any seemingly impossible order. The cold wind was biting, but Clive felt that his chest seemed to be burning with a soldering iron. White Dew City, the capital of the Eastern region, the territory of the House of St. Prospero. It was also the place where Marquis Garcia was imprisoned. The shame of the Shadow Canyon could not be washed away by the blood of the Pegasus Legion alone. After landing on the south side of the Alsis Mountain, this blood cavalry seemed to have returned to the sky ice field again, and found the feeling of galloping unhindered and stabbing into the enemy's chest like a sharp blade. Clive drank a mouthful of liquor on the horse and stuffed a few pieces of beef jerky into his mouth. The whole process did not slow down at all. This was the basic skill of every blood cavalry officer, and they could even sleep on the back of the horse. After 5 days and 5 nights of galloping, Clive was convinced that White Dew City should be not far away. Suddenly, a low bugle sounded in front of him. Clive's heart trembled, and he immediately reduced the speed of the horse slowly. However, the blood in his heart was boiling more fiercely because he understood White Dew City finally arrived. Chapter 456. Late at night. Knight Rupert was squatting beside a brazier on the city wall of White Dew City, carefully wiping his sword. Rupert was a typical knight of the Eastern region. He was in his early 30s, handsome and dignified. Compared to a knight, he looked more like a romantic bard. Only his carefully trimmed beard made his face look a little more robust. He was one of the few veterans of the Sky Horse Legion. During the battle at Shadow Canyon, Knight Rupert had been seriously injured. He had returned to the Eastern region to recuperate and hadn't been able to follow Marquis Vincent to Silver Moon City. When Knight Rupert was injured, he was secretly upset that he couldn't follow the army to Silver Moon City and missed a good opportunity to perform meritorious deeds. Now that he thought about it, he was secretly glad. If he hadn't been injured, he would have been one of the dead souls in Silver Moon City. As the direct descendant of the St. Prost family, the Lord of the Eastern region, the Heavenly Horse Legion must be rebuilt as soon as possible. Moreover, the replenishment of troops, logistical support, equipment supply, and so on were the first priority. Therefore, in just over a year, the Heavenly Horse Legion, which was almost completely wiped out, was quickly replenished to almost 100,000 soldiers. It was as if the Sky Horse Legion had been reborn. However, Knight Rupert knew very well that the Sky Horse Legion now was completely different from the one before. Although the new recruits had undergone more than a year of training and looked like soldiers, Knight Rupert knew very well that they were just for show. They were far from being the real elites, let alone the fierce army at the northern frontier. Thinking of this, the bloody scene at Shadow Canyon couldn't help but appear in Knight Rupert's mind. The half of his body that had been injured was aching. When the cold wind blew, it was even more unbearable. Knight Rupert quickly moved closer to the brazier. Of course, the rebuilding of the Sky Horse Legion was a good thing for people like Knight Rupert. After all, there were many vacant positions. Knight Rupert's military rank had also risen. Otherwise, with his strength as a third-grade knight and his family background, he wouldn't have been able to become a Chiliarch of the Sky Horse Legion. However, recently, the situation in the Eastern region had been worrying Knight Rupert. Although there was still no conclusion as to what had happened in the Battle of Alfalfa City, all kinds of rumors were still flying around. Did Earl Hall betray the House of St. Prospero? Is the new Shuai River still under the control of the Eastern region? And the bloody cavalry? Where are they now? Knight Rupert was most concerned about the last question. To be honest, he really didn't want to run into that terrifying northern frontier cavalry again. As he was thinking, a strange feeling rose in his heart. Knight Rupert was stunned and tilted his head to listen. It seemed that something was really happening. Knight Rupert immediately stood up and walked to the city wall with his sword in hand, looking out. Tonight, the stars were lonely, and the moon was hidden behind the clouds. It was pitch black outside the city, and nothing could be seen. However, Rupert still felt that something was wrong. This was the intuition of a veteran who had been on the battlefield for many years. Knight Rupert randomly selected a group of soldiers and began to patrol the city carefully. However, after a round of patrolling, he found nothing. It seemed that he was just being paranoid. Just as Knight Rupert was about to give up on patrolling and return to the fire to continue warming himself, a creaking sound clearly entered his ears. Before the soldiers could react, Knight Rupert was immediately alerted. He turned around and shouted, "Go and see if someone wants to open the city gate." The soldiers looked at each other, wondering if their commander had gone crazy. Who would dare to disobey a military order to open the city gate at this time? But then, the faint sound of horse hooves could be heard outside the city, shattering the silence of the winter night. As far as the eye could see, a fire dragon under the hazy moonlight was spreading over like a tide. Now, even the recruits of the Sky Horse Legion who had never been on the battlefield understood what was going on. Enemy attack. Quick! Blow the horn! Blow the horn! Knight Rupert shouted at the top of his lungs. Woo! The low sound of the horn was instantly heard from the city wall. Knight Rupert's reaction speed was not slow, but the newly formed Sky Horse Legion was still too young. Due to the lack of a large number of experienced officers, they did not know how to guard the city gate when they heard the horn. Instead, they fell into panic and did not know what to do. In addition, it was late at night, and military orders could not be transmitted smoothly. When Knight Rupert led the soldiers to the city gate, he was shocked to find that the vanguard cavalry outside the city was less than 500 steps away. With such a short distance, the cavalry would arrive in the blink of an eye. At this time, even if they wanted to close the city gate, it was too late. Knight Rupert did not know how the city gate was opened, but at this time, he did not have the time to think about it. Because with the help of the fire, he could see the enemy's flag, Bloody Cavalry. The name changed, but the terror did not decrease at all. Knight Rupert's old injury began to ache again. He suppressed the fear in his heart and shouted, "Block the city gate." Block? Block with what? Of course, with human lives, flesh and blood. But unfortunately, not everyone had the courage, especially this group of new soldiers who had never experienced a battle. What's more, they were facing the Bloody Cavalry, which made the Sky Horse Legion tremble in its heyday. Therefore, when Knight Rupert stood at the city gate with his sword in both hands, he found that there was no one beside him. A wave of sadness surged in his heart. Was the Sky Horse Legion so weak now? Facing the northern frontier cavalry alone, Knight Rupert seemed to have returned to the Shadow Canyon a year ago. Suddenly he calmed down. There was no fear, no anger, only a kind of relief and relief. The familiar faces of the Pegasus Legion appeared in Rupert's mind, and he roared, "Let's go!" He shouted, "Brothers, I'm coming to accompany you." Bang! Like a sandstone in front of a huge wave, Knight Rupert was sent flying as soon as he came face to face with the wave. The fierce wave of cavalry continued to roll forward without any delay. The slaughter began to spread in the city. White Dew Castle. The butler, who always paid special attention to etiquette, rushed into the study in a panic and reported in a trembling voice, "Old master, bad news. The Bloody Cavalry entered the city." The Duke of St. Prospero, who was playing chess with Marquis Vincent, didn't seem to be surprised at all. He didn't put down the crystal chess piece in his hand, and his eyes were still fixed on the chessboard. Which gate? How did they get in? Influenced by the calmness of the Duke of St. Prospero, the butler took a few deep breaths, calmed down, and said, "They entered from the north gate. The current information is that a mole secretly opened the north gate and let the Bloody Cavalry in." "I see." The Duke of St. Prospero nodded. Seeing this, the butler suddenly relaxed a lot. Obviously, the Duke of St. Prospero had expected all of this. Perhaps, this was a trap set by the Duke against the Bloody Cavalry. Therefore, seeing that the Duke of St. Prospero didn't have any further instructions, the butler bowed, left the study, and closed the door on his way out. In the study, Vincent looked at the Duke of St. Prospero with a dignified look, and said in a low voice, "Well, Father, do you believe me now?" Chapter 457. In the study, the Duke of St. Prospero raised his head and glanced at his eldest son. There was an inexplicable deep meaning in his eyes. Upon seeing this, Marquis Vincent's face showed undisguised disappointment, as well as a trace of loss and indignation. He sighed and said, "Father, you said you weren't biased. Back then, my younger brother concluded that I had been assassinated in Silvermoon City based on some rumors, and you believed him almost immediately. But now, the irrefutable facts are in front of you, but you still refuse to believe me." The Duke of St. Prospero still didn't speak. He just put the crystal chess piece in his hand on a position on the chessboard, and then looked at his son quietly, as if saying, "It's your turn." Marquis Vincent threw the chess piece in his hand on the chessboard, disrupting the game. The Duke of St. Prospero frowned and was about to reprimand when he heard his son say, "Father, you still don't understand? Evan has been eyeing the position of the Duke of the Eastern region from the beginning. For this reason, he ignored the Brotherhood and insisted that I had been killed in Silvermoon City. In the end, you forced Earl Hall to rebel in order to help him to the position. Also, when he gathered the Lord's army in Tinder City to encircle and annihilate Colin Angelo, didn't he know that there were only 3,000 blood cavalry in Linchue City at that time? Where is the real main force of blood cavalry? Just use your brain a little and you will know." But Evan knew that Colin Angelo was using himself as a bait, but he still didn't care about the real threat. Instead, he gathered the army and marched to Linchue City. This kind of behavior was simply harboring evil intentions. Even secretly, I'm afraid he can't wait for White Dew City to be breached by the main force of blood cavalry. It would be best if you and I were buried in the hands of blood cavalry. Then, wouldn't he become the first successor of the Duke of the Eastern region? If he catches Colin Angelo, Evan, will be the hero of the Eastern region. After quietly listening to his son's bitter and hateful complaints, Duke St. Pros expressionlessly said, "Don't worry." Evan's action of gathering the Lord's coalition to encircle and annihilate Colin Angelo was approved by me. You approved? Marquis Vincent's heart trembled. The Duke of St. Prospero continued, "After I figured out Colin Angelo's plan, I immediately sent a message to Tinder City, asking Evan and Count Bruggen to ignore the safety of White Dew City and make capturing Colin Angelo their top priority." Marquis Vincent didn't know what to say. But then, the Duke of St. Prospero opened his mouth again. However, judging from the timing of the Lord's army's deployment, Evan had already asked the Lords to cooperate with him to annihilate Colin Angeli before he received my order. Marquis Vincent's face lit up, and he immediately said, "Father, I was right." Evan has never considered the safety of White Dew City. In his eyes, you're not as important as Colin Angeli. If he can catch Colin Angeli, I won't blame him for acting on his own. What? Marquis Vincent was stunned for a moment before he realized what the Duke of St. Prospero was hinting at. Did he let Colin Angelo slip away? The Duke of St. Prospero sneered, and his tone finally revealed uncontrollable anger. "Slip away? I just received news that the blood cavalry broke through to the south and encountered the Fire Velvet Army. After a great battle, the Fire Velvet Army was completely annihilated." Completely annihilated? Marquis Vincent was also shocked by the news. The blood cavalry north of the Alsace Mountains only has 3,000 people, right? Yes. The Duke of St. Prospero's eyes flashed with a dangerous light. Do you know how the Fire Velvet Army was defeated? Could it be that Evan, that guy who doesn't know anything about military affairs, blindly commanded? Marquis Vincent guessed. It was his guardian knight Fletcher who beheaded Count Bruggen at the last minute. What? Is he crazy? Marquis Vincent couldn't help but chuckle in his heart. He originally thought that he would never be able to regain his father's trust, but he didn't expect his brother to do such a thing. But then, Marquis Vincent realized that this must be Colin's arrangement. Thinking of this, Marquis Vincent couldn't help but lower his head, quietly hiding the light in his eyes. To be honest, I can only think that Evan or his knights are crazy. The Duke of St. Prospero sighed, suddenly feeling tired. Marquis Vincent immediately said, "Father, don't you understand? I'm afraid that Evan has already colluded with the northern frontier." Colluded with the northern frontier? The Duke of St. Prospero pursed his lips. His surname is St. Prospero. How can he collude with the northern frontier? What can Colin Angeli promise him? For example, the position of Duke of the Eastern region? Don't be fooled by your current position of Marquis of the Eastern region. I've already decided to make Evan the first successor. The entire Eastern region will be his in the future. Why would he do something so unnecessary? A trace of anger flashed in Marquis Vincent's eyes, but then he shook his head and said, "Father, this is the promise you made before the fiasco in Alfalfa City. Maybe Evan knows that he has made a big mistake and is worried that you will change your mind again. So then he won't be stupid enough to destroy the Fire Velvet Army." The Duke of St. Prospero said angrily, "He's already engaged to Count Brugen's daughter, and the Fire Velvet Army is his solid backing. Without the Fire Velvet Army, he doesn't even have the right to beg for my forgiveness." Marquis Vincent spread his hands and said, "Father, after saying so much, you still don't want to believe that Evan has betrayed you. Then there's nothing I can do." The Duke of St. Prospero stared at his eldest son for a long time, and finally spoke again. "No, it's true that I don't trust Evan anymore." Marquis Vincent's face lit up, but then he heard the Duke of St. Prospero continue coldly, "But I can't trust you either. If it weren't for Anna's whereabouts, I would have already made a new will and made her the first successor." "Father!" Marquis Vincent couldn't help but hit the table. "Why won't you trust me?" The Duke of St. Prospero looked straight into his eldest son's eyes and asked in a deep voice, "Then explain to me why Colin Angelo let you come back." "Didn't I already say it? It was you who used half of the Pegasus Navy to redeem me." The Duke of St. Prospero didn't wait for Marquis Vincent to finish speaking and coldly interrupted, "If you continue to try to fool me with this kind of lie, you'll never be able to gain my trust." Marquis Vincent's expression froze, but he immediately recovered and continued to quibble. "But father, this is the truth." The Duke of St. Prospero sneered, "It's been so long. Do you still think that I can't find out anything about what happened in Alfalfa City that day?" "Father, what did you find out?" "I found out." The Duke of St. Prospero clenched the crystal chess piece in his hand so tightly that he almost crushed it into powder. "It was you who helped Colin Angelo persuade Count Hall to suddenly attack the House of St. Prospero's warships." As soon as he said this, the study fell silent. Chapter 458. In the study, the Duke of St. Prospero and Marquis Vincent sat opposite each other. The atmosphere was extremely stagnant. The Duke of St. Prospero kept his eyes on his son's face, as if he wanted to see every subtle change in his son's expression. Marquis Vincent looked down at the chessboard on the table, as if he did not dare to face his father's eyes. The vague shouting came in through the window, but it did not attract their attention at all. It seemed that at this moment, it was not the terrible bloody cavalry in the city, but a group of children playing around, not worthy of any extra attention. Marquis Vincent remained calm on the surface, but his heart was already overturned. The Duke of St. Prospero's words just now made him sure of one thing. Some of the officers of the Hall family had betrayed him. Of course, perhaps in the eyes of this person, Marquis Vincent and Earl Hall were the real traitors of the Eastern region. Marquis Vincent knew that what he was going to say next was very important, and to really win his father's trust, he had to change his original strategy. The Duke of St. Prospero saw his son fall into a long silence, but did not urge him. He just stared at him with cold eyes, waiting for a reasonable explanation or another disappointing lie. After a long time, Marquis Vincent finally spoke. "Father, if I wanted to harm you, I would not have reminded you that the real target of the bloody cavalry was actually the White Dew City, so that you could arrange all this calmly." Hearing this, the Duke of St. Prospero's fierce eyes finally softened a little, but he still did not want to let Marquis Vincent go easily. He questioned, "Then how did you know the real movement of the bloody cavalry in advance?" Before Marquis Vincent could answer, the Duke of St. Prospero blocked his way in advance. "Don't lie to me with the nonsense, I guessed it." Marquis Vincent's face kept changing, as if he was having a fierce ideological struggle. After a long time, he finally calmed down, as if he had figured something out. "Father, do you remember the most words you said to me when I was a child, when you taught me how to play chess?" The Duke of St. Prospero was obviously stunned, and then he asked in confusion, "What words?" Marquis Vincent finally raised his head and calmly looked back at Duke St. Pros. Then he imitated the other party's tone and said, "Kill the enemy's king, or let the enemy kill your king." The Duke of St. Prospero seemed to understand what his son meant. He asked, "Who are you playing against? Evan?" "Who else could it be?" Marquis Vincent growled angrily. "Do you know that I was indeed assassinated in Silvermoon City? Furthermore, the Knights of the Fine's family were also involved." The Fine family? The Duke of St. Prospero was slightly stunned. He knew that the Fine family was a hardcore supporter of his second son. "That's right. Father, Evan is already on the chessboard, and he's sitting right across from me. Do I have any other choice other than to fight him?" "So you colluded with Colin Angeli and betrayed the Pegasus Navy?" Marquis Vincent paused, then gritted his teeth and said, "You have already begun to clean up my supporters in the eastern region. Do I have any other choice?" When the Duke of St. Prospero heard this, a great sadness welled up in his heart, but more than that, he was angry. The irrepressible anger made the air in the room seem to condense at this moment. Marquis Vincent felt his father's monstrous anger and terrifying oppressive aura, and hurriedly said, "But father, I only pretended to side with Colin Angeli to gain freedom and use his strength to break the situation. But please believe that the current situation is still under my control, and Earl Hall did not really betray the Eastern region." "Did not betray the Eastern region?" The Duke of St. Prospero sneered. "He destroyed half of the Pegasus Navy fleet and helped the bloody cavalry cross the raging Water River. Is this not betrayal?" Marquis Vincent threw caution to the wind at this moment, and he immediately said without backing down, "If Evan had not pushed him too far, why would Earl Hall make such a decision?" "But father, please believe me, Earl Hall has always been loyal to the Eastern region. As long as you forgive his mistakes, the raging Water River will still be a barrier for the Eastern region. As for the bloody cavalry who have already crossed the river, haven't they already fallen into your trap?" The Duke of St. Prospero restrained his aura, but he still sneered and said, "So, I should thank you?" Marquis Vincent also breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that his father had actually softened his heart. He immediately shook his head, put on a painful expression, and said in a deep voice, "No, father. I know that my actions have brought great losses to the Eastern region. Those Pegasus Navy soldiers who died in the hands of our own people, and the souls of the Eastern region who died tragically under the bloody cavalry's rampage, are all because of me. But, is this really only my responsibility? Who pushed Evan onto the chessboard? In the face of this game of chess, do I have any other choice but to do my best to win?" The Duke of St. Prospero suddenly lowered his head, as if he did not want to face his son's resentful eyes. He suddenly felt a little perplexed. Was he really wrong? In fact, a long time ago, someone had warned the Duke of St. Prospero that his second son, Evan, was too scheming, and it was better to cut off his idea of inheriting the Duke of the Eastern region as early as possible to avoid trouble. In fact, the Duke of St. Prospero had listened to this person's advice and sent Evan to Yevil to become a mage. He had been trying his best to help his eldest son, Vincent, cultivate his own forces and stabilize his position as the first heir. It was not until Vincent destroyed the Pegasus Navy in Silvermoon City, and with his wife's urging, that the Duke of St. Prospero began to waver. Now, the Duke of St. Prospero suddenly felt that if he had persisted to the end, all of this would not have happened, right? But soon he put away this meaningless thought. Regret was the most useless emotion. The Duke of St. Prospero was even more unwilling to admit that the current situation was caused by his wrong decision. He raised his head again, looked at his son with a complicated expression, and asked, "Do you have a way to let the Hall family return to the Eastern region?" "Of course." Marquis Vincent answered without hesitation, "The Hall family has never left." At this moment, Marquis Vincent's heart was filled with ecstasy, as if he had survived a disaster. He understood that he had finally regained his father's trust. Of course, it could also be a compromise that he had no choice but to compromise. But no matter what, the chess game that Marquis Vincent was facing was alive. "Father, the most important thing now is to prevent the Blood Cavalry from taking away the Hall family members in White Dew City. None of them will be able to leave White Dew City." The Duke of St. Prospero sneered, his eyes full of confidence. Then he ordered Marky Vincent, I want you to personally bring the Hull family members back to see me. Yes, Father. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.